As the final Roman legionaries departed Britain's misty shores in the early 5th century, they left behind more than just roads and walls. They left a profound silence. The year was 410 AD, and the imperial eagle, which had cast its shadow over these green lands for nearly 4 centuries, had flown for the last time. What remained was a vacuum, a fractured island society, where the grand machinery of Roman administration had ground to a halt. This was not an age of sudden collapse, but a slow, creeping twilight, a world where magnificent villas slowly crumbled and stone cities became the ghostly haunts of a dwindling populace. Tonight, as the world outside grows quiet, let us journey back into that twilight. We will explore the sprawling, epic history of medieval England, a saga stretching across a millennium of faith, fire, and the forging of a nation. This is a story of how a land of disparate tribes became a kingdom, how that kingdom faced down the fury of dragon-proud longships, and how it was reborn from the crucible of conquest. If such tales of ages past capture your imagination and help you drift toward rest, consider subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes so you don't miss our future journeys into history. The Britain that Rome abandoned was a mosaic of fractured tribes and crumbling villas, where the memory of imperial order was a fading dream. The Romano-British people, accustomed to the protection of the legions, now found themselves vulnerable. Raiders from Ireland, the Scoti, plundered the western coasts, while the Picts of the north swept down past the decaying line of Hadrian's Wall. Without a central army or a unified leadership, local warlords rose to defend their own small territories, their power built on personal loyalty and the strength of their sword arm in a land returning to shadow and uncertainty. Across the gray expanse of the North Sea, a change was coming. In the lands we now know as Denmark and northern Germany, restless peoples were stirring, driven by the pressures of a changing climate, expanding populations, and the timeless search for fertile land. New tribes turned their gaze westward. These were the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. They were not a unified force, but a collection of hardy seafaring peoples, their pagan gods demanding courage, and their culture celebrating the glory won in battle and the treasures plundered from enemies. Their arrival was not a single, coordinated invasion, but a slow, relentless tide of migration that spanned generations. It began with small-scale raids, then escalated as warriors were hired as mercenaries by British warlords to fight their rivals. Soon, these mercenaries realized the land was ripe for the taking. They came in their longships, each vessel carrying a warband bound by fierce loyalty to a chieftain who promised them land and spoils in this new, promising island. They brought with them their language, their laws, and their vision of a world shaped by fate and the will of the warrior. Faced with this inexorable advance, the native Romano-British were forced into a desperate choice. Some fled to the rugged western highlands of Wales and Cornwall, carrying with them the last flickering embers of Christian faith and Roman culture. Others bent the knee, slowly assimilating with the newcomers, their language and customs fading over generations. And still others took up the sword, their desperate struggles giving birth to legends, whispers of a great war leader, a Romano-British general who rallied his people for one last heroic stand. This is the seed from which the myth of Arthur would one day grow. From this crucible of conflict, a new patchwork of kingdoms began to form, forged in the image of their Germanic conquerors. These were not the bureaucratic provinces of Rome, but personal fiefdoms ruled by warrior kings. At their heart was the great mead hall, its timbers blackened by smoke from a central hearth, where a lord would feast his loyal warriors, the thanes, and reward their valor with rings of gold and silver. Here, in the flickering firelight, a poet, the scop, would sing tales of heroes and monsters, weaving the oral history of their people and defining the virtues that held their brutal yet vibrant world together. The gods of these early Anglo-Saxons were as rugged and unforgiving as the northern seas they had crossed. Theirs was a pantheon born of a world where winter was a constant threat and the forest held unknown dangers. They worshipped Woden, the Allfather, a wanderer who sacrificed an eye for wisdom and who presided over the glorious Hall of Valhalla, where warriors slain in battle would feast until the final day of reckoning. They revered Thunor, the Thunderer, whose hammer protected humanity from giants, and Tiamat, the one-handed god of war and justice. Their faith was woven into the fabric of their lives. Their gods, not distant beings, but active participants in the struggles of mortals. Their names echoing today in the days of our week. This pagan worldview was one of grim fatalism, a belief in word or fate, an unchangeable destiny to which even the gods were subject. They believed the world would one day end in a cataclysmic battle, a final twilight of the gods, known as Ragnarok. What mattered was not avoiding this fate, but meeting it with courage. A warrior's greatest ambition was to live a life so valiant that their name would be sung in the mead halls for generations. Their story, a beacon of light against the inevitable darkness. This was a world of heroism and honor, where a person's worth was measured by their loyalty to their kin and their courage in the face of oblivion. Yet, as these newly formed Saxon kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, and Kent, began to lay down roots in the fertile English soil, a new force was stirring on the Celtic fringes of Britain. In the windswept monasteries of Ireland and the remote island of Iona in Scotland, Christian monks had kept the light of knowledge alive. They had preserved not just the Gospels, but the classical learning of the Greco-Roman world. This Celtic Christianity was a faith of intense personal devotion, of scholarship, and of a burning missionary zeal to bring the Word of God back to the lands lost to paganism. The first missionaries who traveled from these Celtic sanctuaries into the heart of Anglo-Saxon England were met not with simple barbarism, but with a complex and sophisticated warrior culture. The challenge was not merely to replace one set of gods with another, but to weave the Christian message into the existing fabric of their society. The conversion was a slow, painstaking process, often driven by the influence of Christian queens who married pagan kings, or by rulers who saw a political advantage in aligning with the powerful Christian kingdoms on the continent, such as the Franks in Gaul. A pivotal moment came with the mission of Augustine, sent from Rome by Pope Gregory the Great in 597 AD, landing in Kent. He found a receptive audience in King Athelbert, whose Frankish wife, Bertha, was already a Christian. Augustine's success in converting the king and his court established a crucial Roman Catholic foothold in the southeast, creating a direct link between the fledgling English Church and the authority of the Pope. This Roman tradition, with its structured hierarchy and legalistic framework, would soon find itself in dialogue and sometimes conflict with the more mystical monastic traditions of the Celtic Church to the north. The legendary story of King Edwin of Northumbria captures the profound appeal of the new faith, debating whether to accept Christianity. One of his counselors is said to have compared human life to a sparrow swiftly flying through a warm, bright hall on a cold winter's night. It flies in from the darkness, enjoys a moment of light and warmth, and then vanishes back into the stormy darkness from whence it came. Paganism, the counselor argued, offered no knowledge of what lay before or what came after. Christianity, in contrast, offered the promise of a light that never faded, a hope of eternal life beyond the cold and dark of the unknown. This powerful metaphor reveals the shift in worldview that Christianity offered. It did not erase the old warrior virtues of courage and loyalty, but it reframed them within a new, more hopeful cosmology. The promise of salvation, of a loving God who offered forgiveness and eternal life, was a revolutionary message in a world governed by an unforgiving fate. Slowly, painstakingly, the stone crosses began to replace the pagan idols, and the gentle chanting of monks began to echo in valleys that had once resounded with the war cries of chieftains, signaling the dawn of a new age of faith in medieval England. The spread of Christianity across Anglo-Saxon England was not a simple, uniform process. For a time, two distinct streams of the faith flowed through the land: the Celtic tradition from the north, and the Roman tradition from the south. They differed on matters that seem minor to us now, such as the correct way to calculate the date of Easter and the proper style of a monk's haircut. But these issues represented deeper questions of religious authority and cultural identity. The Celtic Church was decentralized and monastic, while the Roman Church was hierarchical, organized, and looked to the Pope in Rome as its ultimate head. This theological divergence was resolved at a pivotal meeting in 664 AD, the Synod of Whitby, held at the monastery of Abbishilda. This council brought together leaders from both traditions to debate their differences before King Oswy of Northumbria. After hearing arguments from both sides, Oswy made a decisive ruling in favor of the Roman practices. His reasoning was simple yet profound. St. Peter, who held the keys to the kingdom of heaven, followed the Roman tradition, and the king did not wish to be locked out. This decision would have immense consequences, aligning the English Church with the mainstream of European Christendom, and opening it to the rich intellectual and artistic currents flowing from the continent. With this newfound unity, Anglo-Saxon England entered a remarkable golden age of learning and artistry, centered in the great monasteries of Northumbria, such as Monkwearmethro and Lindisfarne. These were not merely places of prayer, but vibrant hubs of culture and scholarship that became the envy of Europe. Monks, who were the intellectuals of their day, dedicated their lives to copying manuscripts, preserving ancient knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. They became master craftsmen, creating works of breathtaking beauty that fused Celtic artistic intricacy with Christian devotion. Perhaps no object better represents this fusion than the Lindisfarne Gospels, created around the year 700 on the holy island of Lindisfarne. This manuscript is a masterpiece of medieval art. Its pages are adorned with fantastically complex patterns of interwoven knots, spiraling birds, and stylized beasts, all rendered in vibrant colors made from crushed minerals and plants. At the heart of this dazzling decoration lies the sacred text of the Gospels, meticulously copied in a beautiful, flowing script. It is a work of profound faith, a testament to a culture that saw artistic beauty as a form of prayer and a reflection of divine perfection. This era also produced one of the greatest scholars of the early Middle Ages, the Venerable Bede, living a quiet, contemplative life at the monastery of Jarrow. Bede was a polymath of astonishing intellect. He wrote on theology, astronomy, and mathematics, but his most enduring work is the ecclesiastical history of the English people. Completed in 731 AD, This book did more than just chronicle the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. By treating the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms as a single people, the gens Anglorum, Bede effectively helped to invent the idea of England itself, creating a sense of shared identity that transcended the old tribal boundaries. The monasteries were the economic and social engines of this flourishing civilization. They owned vast tracts of land, which they managed with increasing sophistication, clearing forests and draining marshes to create productive farmland. They served as schools for the sons of nobility, as primitive hospitals for the sick, and as guest houses for travelers. The abbots and bishops who ran these powerful institutions were not just spiritual leaders. They were often advisors to kings, diplomats, and major political figures in their own right, their influence shaping the destiny of kingdoms. By the close of the 8th century, Anglo-Saxon England had achieved a stable and prosperous synthesis of its Germanic warrior past and its new Christian identity. Its kingdoms had developed sophisticated systems of law and governance. Its scholars were respected throughout Europe, and its missionaries, like Saint Boniface, were actively converting pagan tribes in Germany. It seemed that this golden age of peace and learning might last forever. But across the gray waters of the North Sea, in the fjords of Scandinavia, a new storm was gathering. A people of unparalleled ferocity were preparing their longships, their eyes fixed on the rich, undefended monasteries of the English coast. The age of the Vikings was about to begin. The first sign of the coming storm appeared as if from a nightmare. On a summer's day in 793 A.D., strange ships with dragon-prowed heads carved into their timbers materialized from the sea mists off the coast of Northumbria. Their target was the most sacred site in the kingdom, the holy island of Lindisfarne, the very heart of English Christianity and learning. The attack was swift, sacrilegious, and utterly brutal. The monks, who had known nothing but peace, were slaughtered where they stood or dragged away in chains. The magnificent treasures of the church, including the bejeweled covers of the Lindisfarne Gospels, were plundered, and the monastery was set ablaze. The news of this desecration sent a shockwave of terror and disbelief across the Christian world. The scholar Alcuin of York, serving in the court of Charlemagne, wrote back to England in horror, asking, "Who has ever heard of such a terror?" It was not thought possible that such an incursion from the sea could be made. These attackers, who came to be known as the Vikings or Northmen, were not just pirates. They were pagans who showed no reverence for Christian holy sites. To the Anglo-Saxons, it seemed as if the wrath of God himself had been unleashed upon them, a punishment for their sins. These Northmen were the masters of the sea, hailing from the rugged lands of Scandinavia. They were a people shaped by a harsh environment and a culture that prized martial glory. They had perfected the art of shipbuilding, creating the iconic longship, a vessel of remarkable design, both strong enough to cross the open ocean and with a shallow enough draft to navigate far inland up rivers. This unparalleled mobility gave them the element of surprise, allowing them to strike deep into the heart of kingdoms at targets that had always considered themselves safe from sea raiders. The initial decades of the Viking Age were characterized by these lightning-fast, hit-and-run raids. Small fleets would appear without warning on the coast during the summer months. They would overwhelm the local defenses, seize whatever portable wealth they could find, gold, silver, and captives to be sold as slaves, and then vanish back across the sea before any organized military response could be mustered. They specifically targeted the monasteries, knowing these centers of learning were also the greatest storehouses of wealth in a largely non-monetary economy, and that their inhabitants were defenseless. This new and terrifying form of warfare paralyzed the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Their armies were organized for set peace battles between rival kingdoms, not for coastal defense against an enemy who could strike anywhere at any time. The psychological toll was immense. A cloud of fear settled over the coastal communities, and the very act of seeing a sail on the horizon became a cause for panic. Monks added a new line to their prayers: "From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us." As the 9th century progressed, the nature of the Viking threat began to change. The raids became larger, more organized, and more ambitious. Viking warbands began to overwinter in England, establishing fortified camps from which they could launch deeper and more sustained campaigns. What had started as seasonal plundering was slowly evolving into a war of conquest. The Vikings were no longer content with just stealing England's wealth. They now sought to seize its land. This culminated in the year 865 with the arrival of a force unlike any seen before. It was not a raiding party, but a vast invading force, which the Anglo-Saxon chronicle grimly called the Misselheon here, the Great Heathen Army, led by the legendary sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, such as Ivar, the Boneless, and Halfdan. This army had not come for gold, but for land and vengeance. They would systematically dismantle the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, one by one, destroying a civilization that had been centuries in the making and pushing England to the very brink of annihilation. The Great Heathen Army moved through England with terrifying speed and purpose. Landing in East Anglia in 865, they first secured horses and then turned their attention north to the Kingdom of Northumbria, which was already weakened by internal civil war. They seized the great city of York with little resistance, effectively ending the kingdom that had once been the cradle of English learning. From there, they swept south into Mercia, forcing its king into exile and installing a puppet ruler. The old, powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were crumbling like sandcastles against an unstoppable tide. Their conquest of East Anglia in 869 became the stuff of dark legend. The East Anglian king, Edmund, made a valiant stand, but was defeated and captured. According to tradition, the Vikings offered him his life if he would renounce Christ and rule as their vassal. When Edmund refused, he was tied to a tree, scourged, and used for target practice by Viking archers, until he was bristling with arrows like a hedgehog. Finally, he was beheaded. His martyrdom transformed him into a saint, a symbol of Christian defiance in the face of pagan brutality, but it could not save his kingdom. By the early 870s, only one of the great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms remained independent, Wessex, in the south of England. It was here that the Vikings would face their most determined and resourceful opponent. The man who would rise to meet this existential threat was a young king named Alfred. He was not a natural warrior. As a younger son, he had been scholarly and pious, more suited to the cloister than the battlefield. But fate had thrust him onto the throne in 871, inheriting not a crown, but a desperate war for the very survival of his people. Alfred's greatness did not lie in winning every battle. In fact, his early reign was marked by a series of grueling conflicts and defeats, as the full might of the great heathen army turned upon his kingdom. He fought them to a standstill on some occasions, and was forced to pay them to leave on others. He understood that defeating the Vikings required more than just courage. It required a complete transformation of English society. a new way of fighting, and a renewed sense of purpose. But before he could build, he would first have to endure a trial by fire that would bring him to the edge of utter despair. That low point came in the winter of 878. The Viking leader, Guthrum, launched a devastating surprise attack on Alfred's royal estate at Chippenham while the king was celebrating Christmas. The assault was so sudden and overwhelming that the Wessex army was scattered. Alfred himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing with a handful of followers into the treacherous, swampy marshes of the Somerset levels. For months, the King of Wessex was a fugitive in his own kingdom, hiding in the wetlands. His kingdom all but conquered, the flame of English resistance reduced to a mere flicker in the dark. It was during this time in the wilderness that the famous legend of Alfred and the Cakes is set. Taking refuge in a peasant woman's hut, the disguised and preoccupied king was asked to watch some cakes baking on the hearth. Lost in thought, planning his comeback, he let them burn and was soundly scolded by the woman for his laziness. The story, whether true or not, captures something essential about Alfred's character. A man humbled by defeat, yet whose mind was still working, still strategizing, still refusing to accept that all was lost. From his hidden fortress in the marshes at Athelney, Alfred began to wage a guerrilla war, sending out raiding parties to harass the Viking occupiers. More importantly, he sent out messengers across Wessex, letting his people know that their king was still alive and that the fight was not over. Slowly, miraculously, hope began to return. Men from Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire, hearing the king's call, began to secretly gather their arms and make their way towards an agreed rallying point. In the spring of 878, Alfred emerged from the swamp, no longer a fugitive, but the commander of a new army, ready to risk everything in one final, decisive battle for the fate of England. The army that Alfred led out of the marshes was not a grand host, but it was hardened by desperation and united by a common cause. In May of 878, at a place called Edington, they met the main Viking army led by Guthrum. The battle was ferocious and lasted for much of the day. The Anglo-Saxons formed their traditional shield wall, a near impenetrable barrier of interlocked shields and spears, and withstood wave after wave of Viking attacks. Fired by Alfred's leadership, they fought with the resolve of men defending their homes, their faith, and their very way of life. Finally, they advanced, pushing the Vikings back until their line broke and they fled in terror to their fortress at Chippenham. Alfred's victory at Edington was total, but his true genius was revealed in what he did next. After besieging the Vikings for 2 weeks, until they were starved into submission, Alfred did not seek vengeance. Instead, he sought a lasting peace. He drew up the Treaty of Wedmore, which formally partitioned England. The Vikings would keep control of the north and east of the country, a vast territory that came to be known as the Danneau, while Alfred would rule Wessex and the lands to its west. The most remarkable part of the treaty, however, was a personal one. Alfred demanded that the Viking king Guthrum accept Christian baptism, and Alfred himself stood as Guthrum's godfather. This was a masterstroke of statesmanship. By bringing his former enemy into the Christian fold, Alfred was transforming a pagan warlord into a fellow Christian king, bound by shared oaths and a common faith. It was the first crucial step in a long process of cultural assimilation that would eventually see the Danes of the Danelaw become English. Having secured a fragile peace, Alfred turned his attention to ensuring that his kingdom would never again be so vulnerable. he realized that defeating the Vikings required a complete overhaul of his kingdom's defenses. His most significant innovation was the creation of a network of fortified towns, or burhs. These were strategically placed strongholds, no more than 20 miles apart, ensuring that no farmer or villager was more than a day's march from a place of safety. Walls were raised, ditches were dug, and permanent garrisons were established. These burhs were more than just military forts. They were the seeds of modern English towns. Alfred laid them out with organized street plans and designated plots for markets. They became centers of local government, commerce, and craft, encouraging trade and economic growth. The burh system was a work of immense ambition and logistical brilliance, a planned defense in depth that fundamentally reshaped the landscape and society of Wessex. Alongside the building of walls, Alfred also reformed his army. The old Anglo-Saxon system of the fyrd, a temporary levy of farmers who would fight for a short period before returning to their fields, was inadequate against the full-time Viking warriors. Alfred cleverly divided his fyrd into two halves. One half would be on active duty, manning the burhs or fighting in the field, while the other half remained at home, tending the crops. This rotation system ensured that Wessex could maintain a permanent standing army without crippling its agricultural economy. Finally, recognizing the Vikings' mastery of the water, Alfred began to build a navy. He commissioned the construction of new, larger ships built to his own design to intercept Viking fleets before they could even make landfall. While this early English navy had mixed success, it was a visionary step, laying the conceptual groundwork for the naval power that would one day define England's place in the world. Through these reforms, Alfred was not just defending a kingdom, he was building a new, more resilient kind of state. Alfred understood that military strength alone could not save his kingdom. The Viking raids had done more than just burn buildings and steal gold. They had shattered the culture of learning that had blossomed in the age of Bede. Monasteries lay in ruins, their libraries destroyed, and a generation had grown up in the shadow of constant warfare. Alfred famously lamented that when he came to the throne, there were very few men south of the river Humber who could even understand the Latin of their own church services, let alone translate a letter. For Alfred, this was not just an intellectual loss, it was a spiritual crisis that threatened the very soul of his people. To combat this decay, he embarked on one of the most ambitious educational revivals of the Middle Ages. He invited the most brilliant scholars he could find from across Britain and continental Europe to his court, creating a new intellectual center in a kingdom that had been a cultural backwater. He established a court school to educate his own children and the sons of his nobles, insisting that those who would wield power must first learn the wisdom of the ages. His most revolutionary project was a program of translation. Alfred believed that for wisdom to flourish, it had to be accessible to his people in their own language, Old English. He personally took part in translating what he considered the most essential books from Latin, works of philosophy, history, and theology. These included Pope Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, a guide for bishops on how to lead their flock, and Boethus's Consolation of Philosophy. By rendering these complex texts into the vernacular, Alfred was democratizing knowledge and empowering a new class of literate laymen. Perhaps Alfred's greatest cultural achievement was the commissioning of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. This was more than just a year-by-year record of events. By compiling the histories of the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into a single, continuous narrative written in Old English, the Chronicle created a shared history for a people who had long seen themselves as separate. For the first time, a man from Wessex could read about the history of Northumbria or Mercia as part of his own story. It was a masterful piece of cultural unification, forging a sense of common English identity in the face of a common enemy. The king's reforms extended to the law itself. He issued a new law code, known as the Dombock or Doom Book, which began not with royal decrees but with the 10 Commandments from the Bible. Alfred did not invent a whole new legal system. Instead, he carefully studied the existing laws of the different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, of Kent, Mercia, and Wessex, and selected the ones he thought were most just. He sought to create a single, unified legal framework for his people, one founded on Christian principles of mercy, fairness, and the idea that the law should protect the weak from the strong. These efforts reveal the true depth of Alfred's vision. He believed that a kingdom's strength was not measured solely by its armies or its fortifications, but by the wisdom of its rulers and the faith of its people. The walls of the burhs could keep the Vikings out, but only education and a shared culture could preserve what was worth defending within those walls. He was not just saving England from the Vikings. He was consciously shaping what England would mean for centuries to come. Alfred the Great died in 899, leaving behind a kingdom that had been utterly transformed. He had inherited a realm on the verge of extinction and left it with a secure defense system, a reviving culture, and a burgeoning sense of national identity. His successors, his son Edward and his grandson Aethelstan, would build upon the strong foundations he had laid, moving from defense to offense, and beginning the long, arduous task of reclaiming the Danelaw and forging a single, united kingdom of England. The foundations laid by Alfred were so strong that the task of English reconquest could begin almost immediately after his death. His son, Edward the Elder, who succeeded him, was a formidable military commander in his own right. Yet he did not work alone. In a remarkable partnership, Edward joined forces with his sister, Telfold. Following her husband's death, Telfold ruled the kingdom of Mercia, not as a regent, but as the Lady of the Mercians, a respected and brilliant leader in her own right. Together, this royal brother and sister duo executed a coordinated strategy to push back the frontiers of the Danelaw. While Edward consolidated his power in the south, Telfold led her Mercian armies in the Midlands. She was every bit her father's daughter, a skilled strategist and a prolific builder of burhs, extending Alfred's defensive network deep into enemy territory. For a decade, brother and sister worked in tandem, their armies liberating towns like Derby and Leicester from Danish control. Aethelflaed's leadership was so effective that she became a figure of legend, a warrior queen who commanded the fierce loyalty of her soldiers and the respect of her enemies. Upon Edward's death, the crown passed to his son, Aethelstan, who had been fostered at his aunt Aethelflaed's court in Mercia. It was Aethelstan who would fully realize his grandfather Alfred's dream. He was a man of immense ambition, a charismatic warrior, and a skilled diplomat. He quickly moved to assert his authority over the entire island. In 927 A.D., he marched his army north and captured the great Viking city of York, the last major Danish stronghold. Following this victory, he summoned the other rulers of Britain, the kings of the Scots and the Welsh, to meet him, where they acknowledged his overlordship. For the first time, one Anglo-Saxon king held direct rule over all of England. This new unity, however, was still fragile. Athelstan's supremacy was deeply resented by the other powers in Britain, who saw him as an overmighty threat. In 937 AD, a grand coalition was formed against him, a formidable alliance of the Viking king of Dublin, the Scottish king, and the king of Strathclyde. They invaded the north of England with a massive fleet, determined to shatter Athelstan's new kingdom and reclaim their lost territories. The two sides met at a place called Brunanburh, the exact location of which is now lost to history. The battle that followed was one of the largest and bloodiest of the entire Anglo-Saxon period, an epic clash that would be immortalized in a famous Old English poem. Aethelstan and his brother Edmund led the English forces from the front. The fighting lasted all day, a brutal and exhausting melee of shield walls and hacking axes. By the time the sun set, the great coalition was utterly crushed. 5 kings and 7 earls lay dead on the battlefield. The victory was so decisive that it was never challenged again. The Battle of Brunanburh was more than a military triumph. It was the birth certificate of the Kingdom of England. It confirmed that the unified state created by the House of Wessex was here to stay. Athelstan was no longer just the king of the West Saxons. He was now undisputedly Rex Anglorum, king of the English. He presided over a sophisticated and prosperous realm, his court a hub of European diplomacy, his laws bringing order to a diverse population of Anglo-Saxons and assimilated Danes. Under Athelstan's rule, the administrative systems first developed by Alfred were refined and extended across the entire country. The land was divided into shires, each with its own burgh as an administrative center and a royal official, the shire reeve or sheriff, to enforce the king's law. A single currency was established, with coins bearing the king's image minted in towns across the realm, a powerful symbol of a unified and centrally governed kingdom. The state that Alfred had envisioned, and that his children had fought for, had finally been brought into being. Following the monumental victory at Brunanburh, England entered a period of relative peace and stability. The dynasty of Alfred had succeeded in creating a powerful, unified, and well-governed kingdom that was the envy of its neighbors. This era reached its zenith during the reign of Athelstan's nephew, Edgar, who ruled from 959 to 975. His reign was so secure and prosperous that he earned the title Edgar the Peaceful, not because he never fought, but because his strength was so evident that few dared to challenge him. The climax of Edgar's reign was his spectacular coronation ceremony at Bath in 973. This was no ordinary crowning. It was a carefully staged piece of political theater designed by his advisor, the Archbishop Dunstan, to echo the imperial coronations of the Roman emperors. After the ceremony, Edgar is said to have sailed on the River Dee with his barge rowed by 6 other kings from across Britain, including the King of Scots and Welsh princes, who symbolically acknowledged his overlordship. This event marked the high water mark of Anglo-Saxon power and prestige. This period of peace also allowed for a great religious and cultural revival known as the Benedictine Reform. For decades, many of the old monasteries had fallen into a state of decay, their lands held by secular lords and their monks lax in their duties. A new generation of devout and energetic churchmen, led by Archbishop Dunstan of Canterbury, sought to restore the purity and discipline of monastic life. They re-established monasteries across the land, enforcing the strict rule of Saint Benedict, which emphasized prayer, study, and manual labor. These reformed monasteries once again became vibrant centers of learning and art. Just as they had been in the age of Bede, the monks drained their lands, becoming expert farmers, and grew wealthy from England's booming wool trade. In their script, they produced some of the most beautiful illuminated manuscripts of the Middle Ages. Works like the Benedictional of St. Thelwold are a testament to the period's artistic genius, with lavish illustrations in gold and brilliant colors depicting biblical scenes with a unique and expressive English style. The government of late Anglo-Saxon England was remarkably sophisticated for its time. The systems of shires and sheriffs were well established, allowing the king's law to be enforced throughout the realm. A complex system of taxation and a stable, reliable currency provided the crown with significant revenues. The kingdom was at peace internally, and the Danes of the Danelaw had largely integrated, becoming Christian farmers and traders who lived under English law. The realm was prosperous, orderly, and secure. This golden age, however, was tragically brief. Edgar the Peaceful died young in 975, leaving behind two young sons, Edward and Tellard. His death immediately sparked a succession crisis, and the ensuing political turmoil culminated in the murder of the young King Edward in 978, allegedly on the orders of his stepmother, so that her own son, Ethelred, could take the throne. This dark deed cast a shadow over the start of the new king's reign and was seen by many as a terrible omen for the future. The new king Tellard would become known to history as Tellard the Unready. The nickname is a pun on his name, which means noble counsel. Unready meant ill-counseled. He inherited a kingdom at the peak of its power, but he lacked the wisdom and fortitude of his ancestors. Just as England seemed most secure, a new and far more organized wave of Viking attacks was about to begin. This time led not by disparate war bands, but by the powerful kings of a newly unified Denmark. The peaceful kingdom was about to face a trial by fire. It was tragically unprepared to meet. The renewed Viking attacks that began in the 980s were a different beast from the raids of Alfred's time. These were not the disorganized war bands of the past. The attackers were now professional armies, often led by the kings of Denmark and Norway themselves, rulers of powerful, newly consolidated kingdoms. Their fleets were larger, their soldiers better equipped, and their objective was more sinister. They sought not just random plunder, but systematic extortion in the form of a massive protection payment, a tribute that came to be known as the Danegeld. Faced with this new, overwhelming threat, King Tellard and his advisors made a fateful decision. Instead of organizing a sustained military resistance in the spirit of Alfred, they chose to buy peace. In 991, after a significant English defeat at the Battle of Malden, Tellard paid the Vikings a colossal sum of 10,000 pounds of silver to leave the kingdom. This policy of appeasement was a catastrophic failure. It drained the English treasury, crippled the economy, and, worst of all, it sent a clear message to Scandinavia. England was rich, and its king was willing to pay to avoid a fight. The Danegeld became a devastating cycle of extortion. The Vikings would depart with their silver, only to return a few years later with a larger fleet, demanding an even greater sum. The payments escalated astronomically: 16,000 pounds, then 24,000, then 36,000. An entire system of national taxation had to be created just to meet these demands. The English people were bled dry to pay off an enemy who only grew stronger and more rapacious with each payment. The spirit of defiance that had defined Alfred's era had been replaced by a weary sense of resignation. In a moment of desperation and spectacularly poor judgment, Tellard decided to switch from appeasement to brutality. On St. Brice's Day, November 13th, 1002, he secretly ordered the massacre of all Danish men living in England, fearing they were part of a plot to overthrow him. This act was not only a moral outrage, but a strategic blunder of epic proportions. Many of the victims were not warriors, but peaceful settlers and merchants who had lived in England for generations. Crucially, one of the victims was believed to be Gunhild, the sister of King Svein Forkbard of Denmark, one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. Svein's response was not just a raid for money, but a campaign of pure vengeance. For the next decade, his armies relentlessly ravaged England, burning towns and devastating the countryside with a methodical fury. The English defense, plagued by incompetent leadership, betrayal, and a collapse in morale, proved utterly ineffective. The sophisticated administrative state built by Alfred's dynasty was now used primarily to collect the endless taxes needed to pay for failed armies and ever-increasing Danegeld. The kingdom that had once been the most powerful in Britain began to disintegrate. Local lords made their own separate peace with the Vikings, while the national army was crippled by distrust and desertion. The people of England, exhausted by decades of war and crushing taxation, lost faith in their king. The end came in 1013, when Svein Forkbard launched a full-scale invasion, not for tribute, but for the crown itself. He swept through the country, and towns and cities rushed to submit to him. Abandoned by his people, his kingdom conquered, the Tellard the Unready was forced to flee into exile in Normandy. For the first time since the days before Alfred, England had been completely conquered by a foreign power. Svein Forkbard was proclaimed King of all England. The great Anglo-Saxon kingdom, forged through the vision of Alfred and the victories of Aethelstan, had been brought to its knees, not just by the Viking axe, but by the failures of its own leadership. The Viking conquest seemed complete, but fate had a final, dramatic twist in store. Just 5 weeks after being hailed as King of England, Svein Forkbard died suddenly in February 1014. The Viking army in England immediately swore allegiance to his son Canute, but the English lords saw an opportunity. They sent a message to the exiled Tellard in Normandy, inviting him to return and reclaim his throne, on the condition that he promised to be a better king than he had been before. Tellard returned, but the real driving force behind the English resistance was his son, Edmund, who earned the nickname Ironside for his incredible courage and tireless campaigning. What followed was a brutal and exhausting war between two brilliant young commanders. Edmund Ironside, the heroic heir of the Anglo-Saxon dynasty, and Canute, the shrewd and ambitious son of the Viking conqueror. For over a year, they fought a series of savage battles across the length and breadth of England, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Finally, after a climactic battle at a sand dune, the two exhausted leaders agreed to a truce. They met on an island in the river Severn and, respecting each other's skill and valor, agreed to divide the kingdom. Edmund would rule the old Anglo-Saxon heartland of Wessex, while Canute would take the rest of the country. It seemed a workable compromise, but just weeks later, in November 1016, Edmund Ironside died suddenly, likely from battle wounds, though poison was inevitably rumored. His death left Canute the undisputed sole king of all England. The English people braced themselves for the rule of a brutal foreign tyrant, but Canute proved to be a surprise, once his throne was secure, a process which involved a number of ruthless political executions, he underwent a remarkable transformation. He proved to be one of the most effective, wise, and popular kings in English history. He embraced the role not as a conqueror, but as a legitimate Anglo-Saxon monarch, promising to uphold the laws of his revered predecessor, King Edgar the Peaceful. Canute understood that he could not rule England effectively without the support of its institutions. He became a devout Christian, a great patron of the Church, and made a pilgrimage to Rome. He paid off his vast Viking army and sent most of them home, relying instead on a core of elite housecarls and the existing Anglo-Saxon system of government. He proved to be a firm but fair ruler, bringing 2 decades of much-needed peace and stability to a land that had been ravaged by war for a generation. Under Canut's rule, England became the jewel in the crown of a vast North Sea empire. He was simultaneously the King of England, Denmark, and later Norway and parts of Sweden. This Scandinavian empire was held together by his personal authority, but its administrative and economic heart was England. English wealth funded his imperial ambitions, and English churchmen and administrators helped govern his Scandinavian territories. For a brief period, England was the center of a major northern European power. The most famous story about Canute is that of him commanding the waves to turn back. This tale has often been misunderstood as a sign of his arrogance. In truth, the original story was meant to illustrate the opposite, to rebuke his fawning courtiers, who claimed his power was absolute. Canute had his throne placed on the seashore and commanded the incoming tide to halt. When the waves inevitably washed over his feet, he turned to his followers and declared, "Let all men know how empty and worthless is the power of kings, for there is none worthy of the name, but he whom heaven, earth, and sea obey by eternal laws." It was a lesson in piety and humility from a king who understood the true limits of earthly power. Canut's great North Sea empire, for all its grandeur, was a personal creation. It was held together by the force of his will and the respect he commanded. When he died in 1035, this fragile union quickly crumbled. His sons, Harold Harefoot and Harthacnot, lacked their father's wisdom and strength. Their brief and brutal reigns were marked by political instability, assassinations, and crippling taxation that made them deeply unpopular. The Danish dynasty, which had begun with such unexpected brilliance under Canute, fizzled out in less than a decade. By 1042, with Harthacnut's death, the leading men of England had grown weary of Danish misrule. They decided to look back to the old royal line of Wessex. They sent an invitation to Normandy, to a man who had spent most of his adult life in exile, Edward, the surviving son of Thellard the Unready. With the support of the most powerful earl in the kingdom, Edward returned to England and was crowned king. The ancient Anglo-Saxon dynasty was, at last, restored. The new king, however, was a world away from the Anglo-Saxon warriors of old. Edward was a man of deep, almost monastic piety. He was quiet, gentle, and more interested in prayer and the church than in the messy business of politics and war. Having grown up in the Norman court, he was in many ways more French than English, surrounding himself with Norman friends and advisors and speaking their language. His reign would be a long and largely peaceful one, and his personal holiness would eventually lead to him being canonized as Saint Edward the Confessor. But Edward's unworldly nature created a power vacuum at the heart of his kingdom, and that vacuum was eagerly filled by the most powerful family in England, the House of Godwin. Godwin, the Earl of Wessex, was a cunning and hugely ambitious English nobleman who had risen to prominence under Canute. He and his large family of sons and a daughter controlled vast swaths of the country, holding more land and wealth than the king himself. Throughout Edward's reign, a tense political drama played out between the pious but ineffectual king and his overmighty subject, Earl Godwin. Edward relied on Godwin's power to run the kingdom, yet he also deeply resented it. He tried to counterbalance the Earl's influence by promoting his own Norman favorites to positions of power in the court and the church, a move that deeply angered the Anglo-Saxon nobility, who saw these foreigners as grasping interlopers. The power of the Godwins became so immense that the king was even forced to marry the Earl's daughter, Edith. Meanwhile, Godwin's sons were made earls of other major regions of England. His most capable and charismatic son, Harold Godwinson, became a hugely popular figure, a brilliant military commander who won victories for the king in Wales and who increasingly acted as the sub-regulus, or deputy king, running the day-to-day affairs of the government. The central problem of Edward the Confessor's long reign was his failure to produce an heir. His marriage to Edith was childless, perhaps due to a vow of celibacy on his part. As the years passed, with no son to succeed him, the question of who would inherit the throne of England became the most dangerous and pressing issue in European politics. The king's indecision, combined with the towering ambition of the House of Godwin and the interest of powerful figures across the Channel, was creating the perfect storm for a succession crisis that would, upon his death, plunge the kingdom into one of the most fateful years in its history. The long and peaceful reign of Edward the Confessor came to an end in the first days of January 1066. On his deathbed, the childless king is said to have entrusted the care of his kingdom to the most powerful man in the realm, Harold Godwinson. The very next day, the Witan, the Council of England's leading nobles and clergymen, met and acclaimed Harold as the new king. He was crowned immediately in the newly built Westminster Abbey. It was a swift, pragmatic decision made to ensure the kingdom had a strong, experienced leader in what was certain to be a dangerous time. Harold was the undisputed choice of the English people. He was a proven military commander, a skilled administrator, and, crucially, he was one of them, an Anglo-Saxon, in a land that had grown tired of foreign influence. But in accepting the crown, he knew he was inviting war. Two other powerful and ambitious men across the seas believed the throne of England was rightfully theirs, and both were preparing to take it by force. In Normandy, Duke William was a man of immense ambition, a ruthless and effective ruler who had been forged in the crucible of civil war and rebellion. He claimed that King Edward, his distant cousin, had promised him the throne many years before. More damningly, William asserted that Harold Godwinson himself had sworn a sacred oath upon holy relics to support William's claim. This oath was allegedly made a year or two earlier, when Harold had been shipwrecked on the Norman coast and had become William's guest. To William and his Norman knights, Harold's coronation was not just a political betrayal, but a mortal sin, perjury in the eyes of God. The third great claimant came from the frozen north. He was Harald Hardrada, the king of Norway, whose name meant the hard ruler. He was a living legend, a giant of a man who had spent his youth as a mercenary captain for the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. His claim to the English throne was the most tenuous, based on a murky political deal made between previous Scandinavian kings. In truth, his claim was based on his reputation as the most feared warrior in Europe, and his unquenchable thirst for conquest and glory. Hardrada was not acting alone. He had found a bitter and powerful ally in Tostig Godwinson, Harold of England's own exiled brother. Tostig, who had been driven out of his earldom in Northumbria due to his harsh rule, was consumed by a desire for revenge against his brother. He sailed to Norway and persuaded the warrior king that England was ripe for the taking, promising him the support of the northern English people. As the news of these rival claims reached England, King Harold knew he would have to fight a war on two fronts. He spent the summer of 1066 on the south coast with his army and fleet, waiting for William's invasion. The waiting was tense and exhausting. As the months dragged on, a terrifying omen appeared in the heavens. A bright, hairy star, what we now know as Halley's Comet, blazed across the night sky. To the people of the 11th century, it was a clear sign of impending doom, a celestial warning that the world was about to be turned upside down. Harold had a crown, but the fate of his kingdom now depended on steel, wind, and the fortunes of war. As the summer of 1066 drew to a close, King Harold's patience and resources were stretched to their limit. For months, his southern army had kept a weary vigil, staring out at the empty channel. But William's invasion fleet remained pinned in Normandy by unfavorable winds. With supplies dwindling and the harvest needing to be brought in, Harold made a calculated but fateful decision in early September. He disbanded the southern army and sent his fleet back to London for reprovisioning. Just as he did, the first invasion finally came, but not from the south as expected. Harold Hardrada and Tostig Godwinson sailed their vast Norwegian fleet, perhaps 300 ships strong, into the mouth of the River Humber. They landed their army and marched on the great northern city of York. The northern English earls, Edwin and Mercar, hastily assembled their forces and met the invaders at Fulford Gate. The battle was a disaster for the English. The veteran Norwegian warriors crushed the northern army, and the city of York was forced to surrender to Hardrada, who now styled himself the new king of England. News of the defeat and the fall of York reached King Harold in London. His response was one of astonishing speed and determination, in a feat of military logistics that was legendary even at the time. He reassembled his elite housecarls and summoned the fyrds of the southern shires. Then force-marched his army north, covering the nearly 200 miles to Yorkshire in a breathtaking 4 to 5 days. He moved so quickly that the Norwegians had no idea he was even coming. On September 25th, the Norwegian army was encamped at a place called Stamford Bridge, a few miles from York. It was a warm day, and believing their campaign was over, the Vikings were relaxing. Many had left their heavy mail shirts back at their ships. Suddenly, over the rise of a hill, they saw the sun glinting off thousands of helmets and spear points. It was Harold's English army, appearing as if from nowhere. The surprise was total. The battle that followed was one of the most brutal in English history. According to legend, the initial English advance was held up at the narrow wooden bridge by a single, giant Norwegian axeman. This lone warrior supposedly cut down 40 Englishmen before he was finally killed by a soldier who was floated under the bridge in a barrel to spear him from below. Once across, the main battle raged for hours. Harold Hardrada, fighting with the berserker fury of his ancestors, was struck in the throat by an arrow and fell. Tostig, Harold's brother, was also killed. The death of their leaders broke the Norwegian spirit. The battle turned into a rout and a slaughter. The English army pursued the fleeing Vikings relentlessly. The Norwegian losses were so catastrophic that of the 300 ships that had arrived, only 24 were needed to carry the few survivors back to Norway. The great Viking army was annihilated. It was a stunning, total victory for Harold Godwinson. In a single, bloody afternoon at Stamford Bridge, Harold had ended the Viking age in England forever. He had defeated the most feared warrior in Europe and secured his kingdom from the northern threat. But as the English king stood victorious on the corpse-strewn battlefield, his army was battered, wounded, and exhausted. They were 200 miles from the south coast, and at that very moment, the winds in the English Channel had finally changed direction. William the Bastard, Duke of Normandy, had set sail for England, while Harold Godwinson was celebrating his hard-won victory in York. Duke William of Normandy was making his move. His preparations had been methodical and brilliant. He had spent months assembling a vast invasion fleet and a formidable army of Norman knights, infantry, and archers, including mercenaries from across France, all drawn by the promise of English land and wealth. Crucially, he had also secured the blessing of the Pope, who declared Harold a perjurer and a usurper. William's invasion would be fought under a holy banner, not as a war of aggression, but as a righteous crusade to reclaim a kingdom for its rightful, God-approved ruler. On September 28th, just 3 days after the slaughter at Stamford Bridge, William's fleet landed unopposed at Pevensey Bay on the Sussex coast. His army disembarked and established a fortified beachhead, building a prefabricated wooden castle they had brought with them. William's strategy was not to march inland, but to wait. He began to systematically raid and burn the surrounding countryside. This was a calculated provocation. This land was the personal property of Harold Godwinson himself. William was not just invading England. He was goading his rival, daring him to come and fight on ground of the Normans' choosing. The news of the Norman landing was a devastating blow to King Harold, who received it while still in York, tending to the wounded from his last battle. Once again, he was forced into a desperate race against time. He marched his army, already exhausted from the northern campaign, back down the length of England at a punishing pace, arriving in London in early October. The core of his army, his elite housecarls, were weary and depleted, but their morale was high after their stunning victory. In London, Harold's war council debated their next move. His brother Gyrth wisely advised him to wait in London, gather more troops from the shires, and let the Norman army wear itself out in hostile territory. But Harold, perhaps flushed with the confidence of his victory at Stamford Bridge, and unwilling to let William ravage his own personal lands, made the fateful decision to march immediately and confront the invaders. He gathered what forces he could, and on October 13th, his army arrived near the Norman camp. Harold chose his ground carefully. He positioned his forces atop a ridge with a commanding view of the surrounding area. The location, known as Senlac Hill, was a superb defensive position. The English flanks were protected by steep slopes and woods, and the Normans would have to make a difficult uphill charge to attack them. Harold's plan was to repeat the time-honored Anglo-Saxon tactic, form an unbreakable shield wall, and let the enemy break themselves against it, just as they had for centuries. As dawn broke on the morning of October 14th, 1066, two armies and two worlds faced each other. On the hill stood the English, a wall of infantry fighting on foot, with their great kite shields locked together and their fearsome battle axes ready. At the bottom of the slope were the Normans, an army representing the future of European warfare, a combined force of archers to soften up the enemy, infantry to engage them, and the decisive weapon, the charge of armored knights on horseback. The fate of England hung in the balance. The English were fighting for their homes, their king, and their way of life. The Normans were fighting for land, riches, and the ambition of their duke. The long, agonizing day that followed would not just decide who wore the crown of England, it would change the course of history forever. The Battle of Hastings began around 9 in the morning with the sound of Norman trumpets. William ordered his archers to advance and fire upon the English line, but their initial volleys proved ineffective. Firing uphill, many of their arrows either flew over the heads of the English or thudded harmlessly into the tightly locked wall of shields. Next, the Norman infantry charged up the slope, only to be met by a furious defense. The English housecarls, wielding their terrifying long-handled battle-axes, cut through helmets and mail shirts with devastating blows. The charge faltered and fell back. For hours, the pattern was repeated. William threw his formidable cavalry, the pride of Norman warfare, against the English line. Again and again, the armored knights charged up the hill, their lances aimed only to be repulsed by the impenetrable wall of shields and spears. The English held their ground with grim, stubborn courage. The noise must have been deafening. The roar of men, the screaming of horses, the relentless clang of steel on steel, and the sickening thud of axes on flesh and bones. The battle hung in the balance, a brutal stalemate. A turning point came in the afternoon, as one Norman cavalry charge was repulsed. The Bretons on William's left flank broke and fled in panic down the hill. A rumor swept through the Norman ranks that Duke William himself had been killed. Seeing their enemies flee, a portion of the English line on the right, against Harold's strict orders to hold their position at all costs, let out a triumphant roar and broke formation, charging down the hill in pursuit. This was the moment that called for a leader. Seeing the panic in his own army and the rashness of the English, William rode into the fray, tearing off his helmet to show his face to his fleeing troops. "Look at me," he yelled. "I am alive, and by the grace of God, I shall yet conquer." His presence rallied his men. He then turned his knights on the disorganized English, who had chased them down the hill, surrounding and cutting them to pieces on the level ground. William, a master tactician, had seen the crack in the English discipline. He realized he could turn their eagerness into a fatal weakness. He ordered his knights to perform a series of feigned retreats, charging the shield wall, then pretending to break and flee. Twice more, the tactic worked. Small groups of Englishmen, sensing victory, could not resist the temptation to pursue, breaking the integrity of their line. Each time, William's cavalry would wheel around, encircle them, and destroy them. Slowly, agonizingly, the great English shield wall was being worn down. Gaps began to appear as men fell. Harold's two brothers, Gyrth and Leofwine, fighting by his side, were both killed. As evening began to draw in, William ordered his archers to fire their arrows in high arcs, so they would rain down from above onto the heads of the English soldiers. It was during this barrage that fate intervened. A single arrow, falling from the sky, is said to have struck King Harold in the eye, mortally wounding him. As the king slumped, dying, at the foot of his royal standard, the Normans seized their chance and made one final, desperate charge. They swarmed the spot, cutting down Harold and the loyal housecarls, who were making their last stand around their fallen king. The death of Harold shattered the last remnants of English morale. The shield wall, which had held for almost a full day, finally broke completely. As darkness fell, the surviving English fled into the woods behind the battlefield, leaving the Norman Duke, William the Bastard, the victor, on a hill of corpses. Anglo-Saxon England had died with its king. William had won the battle, but he had not yet won the kingdom. In the immediate aftermath of Hastings, he expected the remaining English lords to come to him and submit. Instead, the surviving leaders in London, including the powerful northern earls Edwin and Morcar, defiantly proclaimed the last male heir of the Anglo-Saxon royal line, the young teenager Edgar Theling, as the new king. They were not yet ready to bow to a foreign duke. Realizing that England would not yield easily, William began a campaign of terror and submission. Rather than marching directly on London, he led his army on a great looping path through the southeast of England, the country's wealthiest and most populous region. He crossed the Thames west of London and descended upon the capital from the north, systematically burning and devastating every town and village that stood in his path. The message was brutal and clear. Resistance would be met with total destruction. This campaign of psychological warfare worked. The English leadership, seeing the devastation and realizing they had no army capable of facing the Normans in the field, lost their nerve. At the town of Berkhamsted, a delegation of the most powerful men in England, including the young Edgar, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the northern earls, came to William and submitted to him. They swore oaths of fealty and offered him the crown, understanding that further resistance would only lead to the complete ruin of the kingdom. On Christmas Day, 1066, less than 3 months after landing at Pevensey, William the Bastard was crowned King William I of England in Westminster Abbey, the same church where Harold had been crowned at the start of the year. The ceremony was a tense affair, a mixture of English tradition and Norman power. But even this moment of triumph was marred by violence. When the Archbishop asked the congregation to acclaim their new king in the traditional English manner, the roar of approval from inside the church was mistaken for a riot by the nervous Norman guards outside. They promptly set fire to the surrounding English houses. The coronation of the first Norman king of England took place against a backdrop of smoke, chaos, and fear. In the first months of his reign, William began the immense task of securing his new kingdom. His first and most fundamental act was to declare that all the land in England now belonged to him by right of conquest. He rewarded the thousands of Norman and French knights who had fought for him by granting them vast estates confiscated from the English lords, who had died with Harold at Hastings. The English aristocracy was being systematically dispossessed and replaced by a new French-speaking ruling class. To control this resentful and conquered population, the Normans brought with them a new instrument of power, the castle, all across the land, but especially in strategic towns and along key routes. The Normans began to erect simple but effective fortifications known as Maton-Bailey castles, a large earthen mound. The motte was topped with a wooden tower, while a larger fenced-in courtyard below the bailey protected stables and barracks. These were not the grand stone castles of later years, but they were stark, alien symbols of military occupation, a constant and visible reminder to the English people that they were now living under foreign rule. William initially attempted to rule alongside the surviving English earls, who had submitted to him, but the peace was fragile. The new Norman lords were arrogant and grasping, and the English people were sullen and resentful. William had won a crown and distributed the spoils, but the true conquest of England had only just begun. The years to come would be filled with bitter rebellion, brutal suppression, and the slow, painful forging of a new Anglo-Norman identity. William's grip on his new kingdom was far from secure. In 1067, when he returned to Normandy to celebrate his victory, England erupted in rebellion behind him. Revolts broke out in Kent, in the Welsh marches, and in the southwest. These were initially sporadic uprisings, the desperate death throes of Anglo-Saxon England, led by the few remaining English lords who refused to accept foreign rule. William was forced to return, and for the next few years he was engaged in a brutal game of whack-a-mole, marching his army across the country to stamp out one fire, only for another to ignite elsewhere. The heart of the resistance was in the wild and fiercely independent north of England. The northern people had always been distinct, with strong Viking influences from the old Danube, and they deeply resented the new Norman lords imposed upon them. In 1069, this resentment exploded into the most dangerous rebellion William would ever face. The northern rebels, joined by the Anglo-Saxon claimant Edgar Theling, and supported by a massive Danish fleet that sailed up the Humber, retook the city of York and slaughtered its Norman garrison of 3,000 men. For a moment, it seemed as if the Norman Conquest might be reversed. The rebellion threatened to spread, and William's position looked precarious. His response, however, was one of terrifying and unforgettable brutality. After paying the Danish fleet to sail away, he marched his army north in the winter of 1069. He was not just aiming to defeat an army, he was determined to crush the spirit of the North so completely that it would never be able to rise against him again. What followed was a campaign that became known as the Harrying of the North. It was not a war, but a systematic, calculated act of destruction. For months, William's soldiers moved through the countryside from the Humber to the River Tees, carrying out their king's grim orders. They burned entire villages to the ground, they slaughtered livestock, they destroyed farming tools, and burned the stores of grain. To ensure the land would remain barren, they are even said to have sown the fields with salt. This was a campaign of man-made famine. The population of Yorkshire and the surrounding areas was deliberately and ruthlessly starved into submission or death. People were reduced to eating horses, dogs, cats, and eventually, according to the chroniclers, even each other. Those who could fled south as desperate refugees, their gaunt faces and hollow eyes a testament to the horror they had escaped. The land was left a blackened, silent, and empty wasteland. The harrying of the North was an act of genocide by the standards of its time, and its impact was profound and long-lasting. It completely shattered the power of the old Anglo-Saxon nobility in the North, wiping them out and replacing them with loyal Normans. The population was decimated, and the region's economy was destroyed for a generation. Nearly 20 years later, when William commissioned his great survey of the kingdom, the Domesday Book, large parts of Yorkshire were still recorded simply as waste. With this final, terrible act of suppression, the English resistance to Norman rule was broken. There would be minor rebellions, like that of Hereward, the Wake in the Fens, but the great uprisings were over. William had secured his kingdom not just through victory in battle, but through a campaign of terror that left a scar on the English landscape and memory for centuries. The conquest was now absolute. With the English rebellions finally crushed, William the Conqueror could turn from the brutal work of pacification to the immense task of governing. His goal was to create a system that would secure his dynasty's hold on England forever. He did this by imposing a new structure on the country. a rigid hierarchy of land ownership and obligation that is now known as the feudal system. The core principle was simple and absolute. The king owned all the land. He granted large estates, or fiefs, to his most powerful Norman barons, his tenants-in-chief. In return, they did not pay rent in money, but in loyalty and military service, each being required to provide a set number of trained knights for the king's army. These great barons, in turn, granted smaller parcels of their land to lesser knights, who became their vassals and owed them military service. This pyramid of obligation continued down to the lowest level of society, the English peasants, or serfs. They were tied to the land they worked, not as owners, but as laborers who owed service and a share of their crops to their local lord in exchange for protection. This system ensured that the entire military and economic power of the kingdom was bound by oaths of loyalty that led directly back to the king. To manage this new system effectively, William needed to know exactly what he now owned. 20 years after the conquest, in the winter of 1085, he held a great council and made a momentous decision to carry out a comprehensive survey of his entire kingdom. He wanted a complete record of every piece of land, every town, and every village, who held it, what it was worth, and what resources it contained. This colossal undertaking would produce one of the most remarkable documents of the entire Middle Ages. The survey was an administrative marvel. Royal commissioners were dispatched to every shire in England, armed with a list of relentless questions. They held public inquiries, putting juries of local men, half English, half Norman, under oath to give evidence. They recorded the owner of each manor, both in 1086 and before the conquest in 1066. They counted the acres of plowland, meadow, and woodland. They noted the number of mills, fish ponds, and beehives. They tallied the population, from the lord down to the very last serf, pig, and sheep. The English people, watching this relentless and inescapable accounting, were awestruck and terrified. It felt to them as if the final day of judgment, or doomsday, had come, when every soul's deeds would be recorded in a great book. And so they called the survey's final record the Doomsday Book. Its findings were a stark confirmation of the Norman Revolution. It revealed that in just 2 decades, the old Anglo-Saxon ruling class had been almost entirely wiped out. All but a tiny fraction of the land was now held by the king, his Norman barons, and the church. A French-speaking elite of just a few thousand men now controlled all the wealth and power of a nation of over 1 million people. The survey's completion was followed by another significant event. In 1086, William summoned all the major landowners in England, not just his direct barons, but their vassals as well, to a great gathering on Salisbury Plain. There he made every single one of them swear a direct oath of allegiance to him personally, an oath that would override their loyalty to any lesser lord. With this oath of Salisbury, William reinforced the central principle of his rule. All power, all land, and all loyalty flowed ultimately to the crown. The Norman state, built on conquest and secured by feudal law and bureaucratic genius, was now complete. William the Conqueror died in 1087, not in his grand English kingdom, but in Normandy, from an injury sustained after being thrown from his horse while campaigning in France. His end was an undignified affair, a stark contrast to his powerful life, but the changes he had forced upon England were permanent. The conquest was more than just a change of king. It was a profound cultural shock that reshaped the very identity of the nation. from the language people spoke to the churches in which they prayed. Perhaps the most immediate and obvious change was linguistic. For the next 300 years, England became a country of 3 languages. The new ruling class, the king, his barons, and his knights, all spoke Norman French. This became the language of the court, of government, of the law, and of high culture. The Church continued to use Latin for its services and scholarly work. Meanwhile, the Old English spoken by the Anglo-Saxon population was demoted to the tongue of the powerless peasantry, a language no longer written or taught. This linguistic divide would eventually, over centuries, merge to create a new, hybrid language, Middle English, enriched with thousands of French words, the direct ancestor of the English we speak today. The Norman impact on the landscape was just as dramatic. The initial hasty Maton-Bailey castles were soon replaced by colossal structures of stone. William himself began the construction of the iconic White Tower, the heart of the Tower of London. Built with pale stone imported from Normandy, it was a structure unlike anything the English had ever seen. These new stone keeps were not just defensive fortresses, they were overwhelming statements of power. Their stark, imposing geometry designed to awe the local population and proclaim the permanence of Norman rule. The English Church was also completely transformed. William systematically replaced almost every Anglo-Saxon bishop and abbot with men from Normandy or mainland Europe. He appointed the brilliant Italian scholar Lanfranc as his Archbishop of Canterbury. This brought the English Church, which had always been somewhat isolated, firmly into the mainstream of European religious life and under the authority of the Pope. Lanfranc was a great reformer, reorganizing the Church, enforcing clerical discipline, and establishing a clear hierarchy that mirrored the feudal structure of the state. This new Norman Church began to express its piety and power through architecture. The Normans were prolific builders, and they soon began a massive program to rebuild nearly every major cathedral and abbey in England. They tore down the smaller, more intimate Anglo-Saxon churches and replaced them with vast, imposing structures in the grand architectural style known as Romanesque. With their thick, solid walls, massive round pillars, and soaring rounded arches, cathedrals like Durham and Canterbury were designed to inspire a sense of divine grandeur and overwhelming power, reflecting the confidence and authority of their new Norman patrons. The Anglo-Saxon England of 1066 was gone forever. It had been replaced by a new, hybrid kingdom, a place of tension and transformation. An English-speaking peasantry was now ruled by a French-speaking aristocracy. An ancient church was being reshaped by foreign reformers, and the landscape itself was being remade with the stone of Norman castles and cathedrals. The death of the conqueror would not end this process, but would instead open a new chapter, as his sons fought over the powerful, complex, and conflicted kingdom he had created. When William the Conqueror died, he divided his vast domains according to Norman custom. His eldest son, the amiable but ineffectual Robert Curthos, inherited the ancestral duchy of Normandy. His second and favorite son, William Speaky, a man with a fiery temper and reddish complexion, who was known as William Rufus, was given the great prize, the Kingdom of England. The youngest son, Henry, was left with a vast sum of money, but no land. This division immediately created a problem for the Norman barons, many of whom held valuable estates on both sides of the English Channel, and now had to serve to rival lords. William II, or William Rufus, was a formidable soldier, much like his father. but he lacked the conqueror's piety and interest in good governance. He was a rough, profane, and cynical ruler who treated the kingdom primarily as a source of personal revenue. He exploited his feudal rights to their absolute limit, extorted money from the church, and left bishoprics vacant for years so he could collect their incomes. The clergy were scandalized by his blasphemous attitude and extravagant lifestyle, but his soldiers respected him as a generous and effective military leader. The early years of his reign were spent putting down rebellions from barons who favored his more pliable older brother, Robert. William Rufus crushed these uprisings with characteristic ruthlessness, securing his hold on the English throne. He even managed to seize control of Normandy itself when Robert decided to join the First Crusade and mortgaged his duchy to his brother to finance the expedition. For a time, it seemed that William Rufus, for all his flaws, had successfully reunited his father's empire under his own harsh rule. His reign, however, came to a sudden and mysterious end. In August of the year 1100, the king was hunting in the New Forest in Hampshire. At some point during the day, he was struck and killed by an arrow. The official story was that it was a tragic accident, a stray shot by one of his own hunting party. But the circumstances were deeply suspicious. The king was deeply unpopular with the church and many of his nobles. Most tellingly, his younger brother, Henry, was also present in the hunting party. While the other nobles scattered in panic, Henry did not wait. He immediately spurred his horse and rode at speed, not to his brother's body, but to Winchester, the site of the royal treasury. He seized control of the government's finances and, just 3 days later, had himself crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. By the time his older brother Robert heard the news and could react, Henry's position was secure. It was a swift, decisive, and ruthless seizure of power. The new king, Henry I, was a very different man from the brother he replaced. He was well educated for a monarch of his time, earning the nickname Beauclerk, or good scholar. Where Rufus had been rash and impulsive, Henry was cold, calculating, and patient. He understood, as his father had, that military power had to be supported by the foundation of good law and an efficient administration. To secure his questionable claim to the throne, Henry made a series of shrewd political moves. He immediately issued a Charter of Liberties, a landmark document in which he promised to end the oppressive and illegal practices of his brother's reign. He vowed to respect the rights of the church and his nobles, and to rule according to the just laws of the land. This charter, a precursor to Magna Carta, was a brilliant piece of propaganda to win the support of the native English population. He also married Edith of Scotland, a princess of the old Anglo-Saxon royal line of Alfred the Great. This union symbolically merged the Norman and Anglo-Saxon dynasties, giving his future heirs a legitimacy that none of his predecessors could claim. Having secured the English throne, Henry I still had to deal with his older brother, Robert Curthose, the Duke of Normandy. In 1106, Henry took the fight to his brother, invading Normandy with a powerful army. The two sides met near the castle of Tinchebray. The battle was a decisive victory for Henry, a neat and symbolic reversal of fortune, occurring almost exactly 40 years after his father's victory at Hastings. He captured his brother Robert and would keep him imprisoned for the rest of his long life. The Anglo-Norman realm was once again united under a single, capable ruler. With his domains secure, Henry I dedicated the rest of his long reign to perfecting the machinery of government. He was a master administrator, obsessed with order, efficiency, and the rule of law. He established the Exchequer, a formal government department dedicated to managing the kingdom's finances. Twice a year, his sheriffs would be summoned to Westminster to present their accounts on a large table covered with a checkered cloth that functioned like an abacus, the origin of the institution's name. This system gave the English crown a level of financial control that was unmatched in Europe. Henry also expanded the reach of royal justice. He began the practice of sending judges or justices out from his own court to travel the country and hear legal cases. This meant that the king's law, rather than the varied customs of local lords, was becoming the common law of the land. His reign was a tough one. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle notes that he was a good man, and great was the awe of him, and that no man dared to wrong another in his time. For the common person, his harsh but predictable justice brought a welcome peace and security. By the year 1120, Henry I was at the zenith of his power. He had a peaceful and prosperous kingdom, a formidable government, and, most importantly, a legitimate male heir, his beloved 17-year-old son, William Adelin. The future of his dynasty seemed secure. In November of that year, the king and his court were preparing to sail back to England from Normandy after a successful campaign. Henry boarded his royal ship, while his son and heir, along with a host of other young nobles, decided to travel separately on a brand new vessel, the fastest and most modern in the fleet, called the White Ship. The mood aboard the White Ship was celebratory. The young nobles, full of wine and high spirits, ordered more casks to be brought out for the crew. The crossing began late, a joyous party sailing across a calm, moonlit sea. But in their haste and drunkenness, the crew failed to spot a submerged rock just outside the harbor. The ship struck the rock violently and began to sink almost immediately. A scene of chaos and terror ensued. William Adelin was rushed into a small lifeboat and could have escaped, but he heard the cries of his half-sister, still trapped on the sinking vessel. He ordered the boat to turn back for her. As he drew alongside the wreck, so many other desperate, drowning people tried to climb into his small boat that it was swamped and sank, taking the heir to the throne down with it. Of the 300 souls aboard the White Ship, only one survived, a butcher from Rouen, who clung to a piece of wreckage through the cold night. The disaster was a personal and political catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Henry I's only legitimate son, the future of his dynasty, was gone. The chroniclers say that after he received the news, the king, who had endured so much, was never seen to smile again. His careful plans had been destroyed in a single, tragic moment, and the succession of his kingdom was now plunged into a terrible and dangerous uncertainty. With his only son gone, King Henry I turned to his only other legitimate child, his daughter, Matilda. He had married her to the powerful Holy Roman Emperor, and after his death, she was known as the Empress Matilda. In an unprecedented move, Henry summoned all the great barons of his kingdom and made them swear a solemn oath to accept Matilda as their future queen. The idea of a woman ruling in her own right was alien to the warlike Norman nobility, and many of them took the oath with deep reservations, their fingers metaphorically crossed behind their backs. When Henry I died in 1135, the oaths were almost immediately forgotten. While Matilda was far away in Anjou with her new husband, Geoffrey Plantagenet, another claimant made a bold dash for the throne. This was Stephen of Blois, Henry's favorite nephew, a man who was popular, charming, and well-liked by the English barons. He raced across the Channel, seized the royal treasury at Winchester, and with the support of the powerful church and the city of London, had himself crowned king. The barons, happy to avoid the prospect of being ruled by the notoriously proud and imperious Matilda, readily abandoned their promise to her father. Matilda, however, was not a woman to be trifled with. In 1139 she landed in England with her own army to claim her inheritance, and the kingdom was plunged into a devastating civil war that would last for nearly 2 decades. This period became known to the suffering English people as the Anarchy. It was more than just a war between two cousins. It was a complete breakdown of law and order. With the crown in dispute, the central authority that Henry I had so painstakingly built simply dissolved. Rival barons took sides, but many used the chaos as an excuse to pursue their own private wars and build up their own power. Unlicensed castles, known as adulteran castles, sprang up across the countryside like mushrooms. From these fortresses, local warlords would terrorize the surrounding populace, plundering villages and torturing people for their wealth. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle described the era in bleak terms. They filled the whole land with their castles, and when the castles were made, they filled them with devils and evil men. The war itself was a grim, seesawing affair, with neither side able to gain a lasting advantage. In 1141, King Stephen was captured in battle at Lincoln, and for a brief moment it seemed Matilda had won. She entered London and was declared Lady of the English, but her arrogant and demanding behavior quickly alienated the citizens, who rose up and drove her from the city before she could even be crowned. Later in the same year, Matilda's most important ally, her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, was captured by Stephen's forces. Matilda was forced to agree to a prisoner exchange, and Stephen was released, undoing her victory at Lincoln. The war dragged on, a miserable stalemate of sieges and skirmishes. In one famous episode, Matilda found herself besieged in Oxford Castle during a harsh winter. She made a daring escape, dressing in a white cloak as camouflage and slipping out under the cover of a snowstorm, crossing the frozen River Thames on foot to safety. For 19 long years, the kingdom bled. Fields went unplowed, villages were burned, and trade ground to a halt. The common people suffered immensely in a war that was not of their making. The chronicler, who had once praised the peace of Henry I's reign, now wrote of the anarchy, in a famous and haunting passage, that men said openly that Christ and his saints slept. The strong, centralized kingdom of the Normans had torn itself apart. As the miserable years of the anarchy dragged on, a new generation began to emerge, one that was not content to see the kingdom bleed indefinitely. The focus began to shift from the bitter rivalry of Stephen and Matilda to Matilda's son, Henry, known as Henry Plantagenet, from the sprig of broom plant Plantagenet his father wore in his hat. He was a young man of boundless energy, a fearsome temper, and a brilliant political mind. He had been raised amidst the chaos of war and was determined to claim his inheritance. While still a teenager, Henry became the ruler of a vast collection of territories in France, including Anjou, Normandy, and Maine. He then made the most brilliant political marriage of the Middle Ages. He married Eleanor of Aquitaine, the most powerful and celebrated woman in Europe. She was the recently divorced wife of the King of France and the ruler in her own right of the huge wealthy duchy of Aquitaine in southern France. Overnight, their union created a colossal Angevin Empire that stretched from the borders of Scotland down to the Pyrenees. Henry Plantagenet was now, by a huge margin, the most powerful prince in France. far mightier than his nominal overlord, the French king. In 1153, this formidable young duke landed in England with a small but effective army to press his claim to the throne. By this point, the barons on both sides were utterly exhausted by the decades of pointless conflict. They had seen their lands ravaged and their power diminished. They had no appetite for another prolonged war. They began to seek a peaceful solution. A crucial obstacle to peace was removed when Stephen's own son and heir, Eustace, a warlike young man who was determined to continue the fight, died suddenly. The grieving King Stephen, now old and weary of the struggle, lost his will to carry on the dynastic war for a new generation. With his own heir gone, he was finally ready to negotiate. The armies of Henry and Stephen faced each other near Wallingford, but instead of fighting, their leading nobles brokered a peace. The resulting agreement, known as the Treaty of Wallingford, was a triumph of pragmatic compromise. Stephen would remain the undisputed king of England for the rest of his natural life. In return, he would formally adopt Henry Plantagenet as his son and heir. The war would end, and upon Stephen's death, the crown would pass peacefully to Henry. The kingdom breathed a collective sigh of relief. The 19-year winter of the anarchy was finally over. The arrangement did not last long. Less than a year later, in October 1154, King Stephen died. Henry Plantagenet sailed back to England and was crowned King Henry II without a single dissenting voice. A new dynasty had come to the throne. The young king, just 21 years old, inherited a realm scarred and broken by civil war. Royal authority had collapsed, the king's treasury was empty, and the adulterine castles of lawless barons still littered the landscape. The common people yearned for a return to the peace and order of his grandfather, Henry I's reign. Henry II's first and greatest task would be to tame the chaos, to tear down the illegal castles, and to rebuild the power of the crown from the ruins of the anarchy. Henry II was a man of astonishing, restless energy. He moved through his vast domains at a speed that left his contemporaries breathless, and he brought that same dynamism to the task of rebuilding his shattered kingdom. His first priority was to restore royal authority. He gave the barons of England a stark choice: either dismantle the illegal castles they had built during the anarchy, or he would bring his army and do it for them. Faced with this determined new king, the great majority of the castles were torn down without a fight. The age of the lawless warlord was over. Having restored order, Henry turned his attention to his great passion, the law. He had inherited his grandfather Henry I's genius for administration, and was determined to create a system of justice that was fair, uniform, and, crucially, under the king's control. He wanted to ensure that the chaos of the anarchy could never happen again. His legal reforms would become his most enduring legacy, forming the very bedrock of the English common law system that is still used in many parts of the world today. He greatly expanded the system of itinerant justices, or traveling judges. These royal officials were sent out from his court on regular circuits to every corner of the kingdom. They brought the king's justice directly to the people, hearing cases and overriding the authority of the local feudal courts run by barons. This meant that, for the first time, there was a single common law for all free men in England, not just a patchwork of local customs. Henry's most revolutionary innovation was his use of the jury. This was not yet the trial jury we know today that decides guilt or innocence. Instead, he introduced the concept of a jury of presentment. a body of 12 local men in each district who were sworn under oath to report any known criminals in their area to the king's visiting judge. This was the origin of the grand jury, and it began to replace older, more primitive forms of justice, like trial by ordeal, where guilt was determined by surviving a painful physical test, or trial by combat, where it was decided by a duel. To make this new system accessible, Henry established a system of writs. A writ was a formal written order, issued in the king's name, that a person could purchase to begin a legal action in the royal courts. There were specific writs for specific complaints, such as being unjustly dispossessed of your land. This made the process of seeking justice more predictable and standardized, and it also generated a steady income for the crown. The cumulative effect of these reforms was a legal revolution. Justice in England was becoming less about the arbitrary will of a local lord and more about established procedures, evidence, and the authority of the king. Henry II was creating a state where even the most powerful baron was subject to the law of the land, a principle that would have profound consequences for the future. Through his tireless work, Henry restored not just peace, but the very concept of a well-governed realm. He rebuilt the exchequer, reformed the currency, and brought a new level of professionalism to the administration of the kingdom. The man who had inherited a broken and lawless state had, through sheer force of will, reforged it into the most efficiently governed and legally advanced kingdom in all of Europe. But his drive to bring every aspect of his kingdom under the control of his law would soon bring him into a bitter and tragic conflict with the one institution that claimed to be above his authority, the Church. Henry II's drive to create a single, all-powerful royal law ran into a formidable obstacle: the Church. In the 12th century, the Church in England was like a state within a state. It was a vast and wealthy landowner, and it had its own system of courts and its own laws, called canon law. Crucially, the Church insisted that any man in holy orders, which included a large number of clerks, deacons, and other minor officials, not just priests, could only be tried in a church court, regardless of their crime. These courts could not pass sentences of death or mutilation. Henry was infuriated by this, seeing it as an affront to his authority and a loophole that allowed criminous clerks to commit serious crimes, like murder, and escape proper punishment. To solve this problem, Henry came up with what he thought was a brilliant plan. In 1162, he appointed his most trusted friend and worldly adviser, his chancellor Thomas Becket, to be the new Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Church in England. Becket was a brilliant administrator, a man of the world who had shared the king's lavish lifestyle. Henry was certain that his loyal friend would help him bring the Church to heel. He had made the biggest miscalculation of his life. To the king's astonishment and fury, as soon as Thomas Becket became Archbishop, he underwent a profound spiritual transformation. He resigned his position as chancellor, gave up his luxurious lifestyle, and began wearing a hair shirt of penance beneath his archbishop's robes. The king's drinking buddy had become God's fierce and unbending servant. He now saw it as his sacred duty to defend the rights and liberties of the Church against any encroachment, especially from his old friend, the king. The conflict came to a head in 1164 when Henry issued the Constitutions of Clarendon, a document that formally stated his royal rights over the Church, including the demand that convicted clerks be handed over to his courts for punishment. Under immense pressure, Becket initially agreed, but then, consumed by guilt, he recanted and openly defied the king. The quarrel between the two most powerful men in the kingdom was now public and irreparable. Fearing for his life, Becket fled England and spent the next 6 years in exile in France, from where he continued his war of words against the king. The dispute became an international scandal, with the Pope trying and failing to mediate between the two stubborn and powerful men. Eventually, a fragile truce was patched together, and in 1170, Becket returned to England. Any hope for a lasting peace was shattered almost immediately when Becket excommunicated the bishops who had supported the king in his absence, an act of supreme defiance. When news of this latest act of defiance reached Henry at his court in Normandy, the king flew into one of his famous, towering rages. "What miserable drones and traitors have I nourished and promoted in my household?" he is said to have roared, "who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born clerk." In the heat of the moment, he may have uttered the infamous words, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 of his household knights, hearing their king's fury, took him at his word. They slipped away from court, took a ship to England, and made their way to Canterbury. On the evening of December 29th, 1170, they stormed into Canterbury Cathedral, where Becket was preparing for vespers. They confronted him near the altar, and when he refused to submit, they drew their swords and brutally murdered him, his blood and brains splattering across the holy flagstones. The murder of an archbishop at his own altar sent a wave of shock and horror across the whole of Christendom. Becket was almost immediately acclaimed as a martyr. Miracles were reported at his tomb, and he was canonized as a saint just 3 years later. Henry II was universally condemned. To save his crown and his soul, he was forced to perform a humiliating public penance, walking barefoot through the streets of Canterbury and allowing himself to be whipped by the cathedral's monks at Becket's tomb. The king had been humbled, and Canterbury became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in the medieval world. While the drama with the church unfolded, Henry II ruled over a collection of territories so vast it dwarfed any other in Europe. The Angevin Empire, as it came to be known, was a sprawling patchwork of lands stretching from the highlands of Scotland down to the Pyrenees Mountains on the border with Spain. It included the organized Kingdom of England, the warlike Duchy of Normandy, the ancestral lands of Anjou, and, through his wife, the huge, culturally rich Duchy of Aquitaine. This was not a unified empire, but a personal collection of realms, all held together by the force of Henry's relentless energy and political genius. The architect of much of this empire, his powerful and brilliant wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, had become estranged from her husband. Theirs had been a passionate and stormy relationship, but after the Becket affair and Henry's numerous infidelities, it had curdled into bitter resentment. Eleanor moved her court to Aquitaine, where she presided over a glittering center of chivalry and poetry, and where she began to encourage her sons to defy their father. Henry and Eleanor had 4 surviving sons, a devil's brood, as they were sometimes called, each as ambitious and headstrong as their parents. There was Henry, known as the young king, who had been crowned as his father's co-ruler, but was given no actual power. There was Richard, his mother's favorite, a formidable warrior, who would become known as the Lionheart. There was the cunning and treacherous Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany, and finally there was the youngest, John, the king's favorite, nicknamed Lachlan because he initially had no lands of his own to rule. Consumed by impatience and encouraged by their mother and the King of France, who saw a perfect opportunity to destabilize his great rival, Henry's sons rose against him in the Great Revolt of 1173. The young king, Richard, and Geoffrey all conspired to overthrow their father. It was a massive, coordinated rebellion on all fronts. But Henry II, at the height of his powers, was more than a match for them. He moved with incredible speed, crushing the rebels in France and England, and even captured the King of Scots, who had invaded in support of the revolt. Henry defeated his sons completely, but he showed them a father's mercy, forgiving them and restoring their lands. His wife, Eleanor, was not so fortunate. He captured her as she tried to flee and would keep her imprisoned for the next 16 years. Henry's clemency to his sons, however, was a mistake. The rest of his long reign was poisoned by their constant plotting and betrayals, as they repeatedly allied with the French king against their own father in a seemingly endless cycle of rebellion and reconciliation. The final years of his life were a heartbreaking tragedy. His eldest son, the young king, died of disease while in the middle of another revolt. His third son, Geoffrey, was also killed. The final, crushing blow came in 1189, when his favorite and youngest son, John, joined his brother Richard in one last rebellion. The old king, now sick and weary, was finally defeated. Forced to accept a humiliating peace treaty with Richard and the King of France, he asked to see a list of the conspirators who had betrayed him. The first name on the list was that of his beloved John. The shock and heartbreak were too much for the old lion to bear. He turned his face to the wall, reportedly saying, "Shame, shame on a conquered king." He died just 2 days later, a broken man, abandoned by the children for whom he had built the greatest empire in Europe. The son who inherited the vast Angevin Empire was the walking embodiment of the chivalric ideal. Richard I, known to history as the Lionheart, was everything his father was not. Where Henry II had been a calculating administrator and lawmaker, Richard was a passionate warrior, a celebrated poet, and a charismatic, almost reckless, military genius. He was his mother, Eleanor's favorite, and he had spent most of his life in her culturally vibrant domain of Aquitaine. He was, in essence, a French prince who saw England not as a home to be governed, but as a source of funds for his much grander ambitions. Richard's overwhelming obsession was the crusade. He had taken the Crusaders' vow even before his father's death, and was determined to lead a great Christian army to the Holy Land to recapture the city of Jerusalem, which had recently fallen to the brilliant Muslim Sultan Saladin. His first and only priority upon becoming king was to raise a colossal sum of money to finance this expedition. He began by selling off nearly every royal office, castle, and piece of land he could. He famously declared that he would have sold London itself if he could have found a buyer. England was bled dry to fund its new king's holy war. Having amassed his fortune, Richard departed for the Third Crusade in 1190, joining forces with King Philip of France in the Holy Land. His military prowess became the stuff of legend. He was a brilliant tactician and an inspirational frontline commander who won a series of stunning victories against Saladin's forces, most notably at the brutal siege of Acre and the decisive Battle of Arsuf. But despite his battlefield successes, the ultimate prize, Jerusalem, remained just beyond his grasp. The crusading army was exhausted and depleted, and Richard was forced to agree to a truce with Saladin that left the city in Muslim hands. His journey home was a disaster. Shipwrecked in the Adriatic, he tried to travel in disguise across Central Europe, but was captured by his enemy, the Duke of Austria, who handed him over to the Holy Roman Emperor. the emperor saw a golden opportunity and demanded a king's ransom for Richard's release, the astronomical sum of 150,000 silver marks, an amount more than double the entire annual income of the English crown. Back in England, the immense task of raising this sum fell to Richard's mother, the now freed Eleanor of Aquitaine, and his loyal administrators. They implemented a tax of unprecedented severity on the entire population, a grueling process that, while painful, also demonstrated the remarkable efficiency of the English government that Henry II had built. While his kingdom labored to buy his freedom, Richard's treacherous younger brother, John, was plotting with the King of France to seize the throne, offering to pay the emperor to keep Richard imprisoned. After more than a year in captivity, the ransom was finally paid, and Richard was released. He returned to England in 1194, but only for a few short weeks to be recrowned and to crush his brother's pathetic rebellion. Then, having secured his kingdom, he left it again, this time forever. The final 5 years of Richard the Lionheart's reign were spent entirely in France, fighting a relentless war against King Philip to win back the castles and territories he had lost while he was imprisoned. He would never set foot in England again. Of his 10 years as king, he spent no more than 6 months in the country he ruled. He was a glorious crusader and a peerless warrior, but to the English people, he was little more than a legend and a constant crushing tax bill. Richard the Lionheart's glorious reign came to a bizarre and undignified end in 1199. He was not killed in a grand battle against Saladin, but by a crossbow bolt fired by a boy from the walls of a minor, insignificant castle in France during a dispute over a rumored treasure hoard. He died from the gangrenous wound, leaving his vast but troubled empire to his younger brother, John, the man who had spent his life living in the shadows of his more glamorous relatives. King John was, in many ways, the polar opposite of Richard. He was not a great warrior, but he was a capable administrator, intelligent and hard-working. However, his character was deeply flawed. He was suspicious, cruel, treacherous, and possessed a singular talent for making enemies. Where Richard had been an absent but admired hero, John was a present and despised tyrant. He had the administrative skills of his father, Henry II, but none of his wisdom, and all of his grandfather's vices. The first part of John's reign was defined by a single, catastrophic failure: the complete collapse of the Angevin Empire in France. The shrewd King Philip of France had been waiting for years for a weak English king, and in John he found his opportunity. Using John's own arrogant missteps as a legal pretext, Philip declared all of John's French lands forfeit. John's subsequent military campaigns were lethargic and incompetent. By 1204, he had lost the Duchy of Normandy, the ancestral homeland of the English monarchy. The loss of Normandy was a psychological earthquake for the Anglo-Norman nobility. For a century and a half, they had been men of two realms, with lands and loyalties on both sides of the English Channel. Now they were forced to choose. Those who wanted to keep their Norman estates had to give up their English ones, and vice versa. This loss, so humiliating for John, had the unintended consequence of forging a new, exclusively English identity among the baronage. Their futures and their fortunes were now tied entirely to the island kingdom. Having lost his empire abroad, John turned his considerable and rapacious energies to ruling England. He proved to be a ruthlessly efficient but extortionate king. He used the powerful administrative and legal machinery developed by his father to squeeze every last penny from his subjects. He levied crippling taxes to fund his failed wars, imposed arbitrary and ruinous fines for minor offenses, and exploited his feudal rights in ways that went far beyond accepted custom. His relationship with his barons deteriorated into one of deep suspicion and mutual hatred. He trusted no one and saw conspiracies everywhere. He demanded their sons and daughters as hostages to ensure their good behavior, and used his legal powers to ruin those who fell out of his favor, unlike previous kings who had governed in consultation with their great nobles. John ruled in a capricious and tyrannical manner, alienating even those who had once been his most loyal supporters. The barons of England, men of proud and warlike Norman descent, were not the sort to suffer such a king indefinitely. They began to murmur amongst themselves, their grievances mounting with each new tax and each fresh humiliation. They were not just angry about money. They felt that the king was violating the unwritten, customary laws of the kingdom and ruling as a despot. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would not just challenge a king, but would attempt to place the law above him for the first time in English history. As if his wars with the French king and his own barons were not enough, King John then stumbled into a conflict with the most powerful man in Europe, Pope Innocent III. The dispute began over the appointment of a new Archbishop of Canterbury. When John refused to accept the Pope's chosen candidate, the brilliant scholar Stephen Langton, the Pope responded by placing the entire Kingdom of England under an interdict in 1208. An interdict was a devastating spiritual weapon. It meant the suspension of nearly all church services across the land. Church bells fell silent. The Mass could not be celebrated. Weddings could not be held in church. And most terrifyingly for the deeply religious medieval mind, the dead could not be buried in consecrated ground. For years, England was a spiritual wasteland, a silent and fearful kingdom, cut off from the grace of God. When this still did not break the king's will, the Pope took the next step and excommunicated John personally, casting him out of the Christian faith. For a time, John seemed to thrive. He defied the Pope and used the interdict as an excuse to seize the vast lands and revenues of the English Church, becoming wealthier than ever before. But his defiance could not last. Threatened with a French invasion that now had the full backing of the Pope, and fearing for his throne, John executed a stunning political reversal. In 1213, he not only accepted the Pope's terms, but went one step further. He surrendered his entire kingdom to the Pope, receiving it back as a papal fief. In a single stroke, John had turned his greatest enemy into his most powerful protector. With the Pope now on his side and his treasury overflowing with confiscated church funds, John felt ready for one last grand attempt to win back his lost empire in France. In 1214, he launched a massive, coordinated attack. It was a complete and utter disaster. While John himself had minor success in the south of France, his main allies were decisively crushed by the French King Philip at the Battle of Bouvines. John was forced to return to England, his grand strategy in ruins, his reputation shattered, and his treasury empty. The defeat at Bouvines was the final straw for the long-suffering English barons. They had been taxed to the point of bankruptcy for a war that had ended in a humiliating failure. They saw their chance to act against a king who was now broke, defeated, and universally despised. In early 1215, a powerful group of rebel barons gathered, renounced their feudal oaths of loyalty to the king, and raised an army. This was a new kind of rebellion. The barons were not, for the most part, trying to replace John with another king. They were fighting for a principle that the king himself must be subject to the law of the land. They had drawn up a document, a charter of liberties, that would formally limit the king's power to raise taxes, to imprison his subjects, and to interfere with the customs of the realm. The rebels marched through a kingdom that was ready to join them. In May, the crucial city of London opened its gates to their army. With his capital in enemy hands and his support collapsing, John was cornered. He had no choice but to negotiate. He agreed to meet the rebel barons in a neutral place, a water meadow on the banks of the River Thames, a place called Runnymede. It was here, in June of 1215, that history would be made. At Runnymede in June 1215, King John, with his kingdom in open rebellion against him, reluctantly affixed his great seal to the barons' list of demands. This document, later known as Magna Carta, or the Great Charter, was not intended as a revolutionary statement of human rights for all. It was, in its time, a practical solution to a political crisis. A feudal document designed by barons to protect their own privileges from a tyrannical king. Yet, within its 63 clauses were the seeds of ideas that would change the world. The charter was wide-ranging, addressing specific feudal grievances about inheritance taxes, the rights of widows, and the taking of property. But a few of its clauses contained principles of lasting and universal importance. The most famous declared that no free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. At the time, free man was a limited category, but for the first time the principle was established that the king could not act arbitrarily, that he was subject to the rule of law. Another crucial clause stated that the king could not levy extraordinary taxes without the general consent of our kingdom, a phrase that planted the first seeds of the idea of no taxation without representation. To enforce all this, the charter included a radical security clause, setting up a council of 25 barons with the power to wage war on the king if he broke the terms of the agreement. It was, in effect, a clause that legalized rebellion. King John, however, had no intention of abiding by a document that had been forced upon him. He was a master of duplicity, and he was simply buying time. As soon as the barons had dispersed from Runnymede, he sent an appeal to his new protector, the Pope, Pope Innocent III. Viewing the charter as an illegal affront to the authority of his vassal, promptly declared it null and void. With the stroke of a pen from Rome, Magna Carta was dead. England was immediately plunged back into a bitter and destructive civil war, which became known as the First Barons' War. The rebel barons, now excommunicated by the Pope and facing the full, vengeful fury of their king, took a desperate and drastic step. They offered the throne of England to an outsider, Prince Louis, the son of the King of France. In 1216, Prince Louis invaded England. He was welcomed by the rebel barons and the citizens of London, and was proclaimed King of England in St. Paul's Cathedral. Although he was never officially crowned, for a time it seemed that the Norman Conquest was about to be reversed, with a French king ruling from Westminster. John's cause seemed hopeless, his kingdom fracturing and his authority collapsing. It was in the midst of this desperate war for his own survival that John's disastrous reign finally came to an end. While campaigning in the east of England in October 1216, the king contracted dysentery. He died a miserable death at Newark Castle, his kingdom in chaos and largely in the hands of a foreign invader. In his final days, in a fittingly pathetic end, his baggage train, containing all his royal treasure, including the crown jewels, was supposedly lost to the incoming tide as it crossed the treacherous estuary known as the Wash. The most hated king in English history was dead. The death of King John left his dynasty on the brink of extinction. His heir, Henry, was just a 9-year-old boy. A large part of his kingdom, including his capital city, was in the hands of a French prince who had been invited to take the crown. The future of England hung by the slenderest of threads, but in its moment of greatest peril, the kingdom was saved by the actions of a few remarkable and loyal men. The leader of the royalist cause was a man who was already a living legend. William Marshall was over 70 years old, a knight who had faithfully served for kings and was widely regarded as the greatest warrior in Christendom. Appointed as regent for the young Henry III, Marshall understood that the kingdom could not be won back by force alone. He needed to win a political war, to persuade the rebel barons to abandon the French prince and return to their natural allegiance. In a move of pure political genius, Marshall and the papal legate, Guala Bikiri, made a crucial decision. In November 1216, just weeks after John's death, they reissued Magna Carta in the young king's name. They removed the most extreme clauses that had challenged royal authority, but they kept the core principles that guaranteed the rule of law. This single act transformed the Great Charter from a rebel manifesto into the foundation of a new, legitimate government. It was a clear promise to the wavering barons. The tyranny of John was over. His son would rule according to the law. This was the turning point. Many of the English barons had made war on John, not on the idea of the monarchy itself. Now that the hated king was dead and his son was promising to uphold their liberties, their reason for supporting a foreign claimant vanished. The war was cleverly It was now a patriotic struggle to expel a French invader. One by one, the rebel barons began to desert Prince Louis and flock back to the banner of the young King Henry. The decisive military encounter came in May of 1217 at the city of Lincoln. The French and rebel forces were besieging the city's castle, which was holding out for the king. The elderly William Marshall, insisting on leading the charge himself despite his age, led the royalist army in a brilliant surprise attack, relieving the castle and utterly crushing the French and rebel army in the city's streets. A final, crucial victory followed a few months later at sea. A French fleet bringing reinforcements and supplies for Prince Louis was intercepted and destroyed off the coast of Sandwich. With his army defeated at Lincoln and his supply line from France cut, Louis's cause was now hopeless. He was forced to agree to a peace treaty, renounce his claim to the English throne, and withdraw from England for good. Through the wisdom of an old knight, the kingdom was saved. The Plantagenet dynasty was secured on the throne, and England was saved from foreign rule. And in a final beautiful irony, Magna Carta, the very document that had been born out of a rebellion against a king, became the instrument that secured the crown for his son, cementing its place at the very heart of English law and identity. When Henry III came of age and took personal control of his kingdom in 1227, he was a very different man from his father. Where John had been cruel, cynical, and treacherous, Henry was gentle, cultured, and intensely pious. He was a devoted husband and a loving father, whose personal life was almost entirely free from scandal. His deepest passion was not for war or politics, but for art, architecture, and his profound Christian faith. He saw himself not as a warlord, but as a holy king, ruling a peaceful and godly realm. The defining project of his long reign was the expression of this deep piety. Henry venerated his Anglo-Saxon predecessor, Edward the Confessor, as the model of a perfect king. He decided to tear down the old Saxon abbey at Westminster, where the confessor was buried, and to rebuild it as a magnificent shrine, a masterpiece of the new Gothic architectural style that was flourishing in France. With its soaring, pointed arches, vast stained glass windows, and intricate decoration, the new Westminster Abbey was designed to be the most beautiful church in Christendom, a fitting resting place for a royal saint. This grand project, however, came at a staggering cost. For decades, it consumed a huge portion of the kingdom's revenues. To fund it, and to pay for his generous lifestyle, Henry was constantly demanding more taxes from his subjects. This caused growing resentment among the barons, who saw their king's piety as a form of extravagant and irresponsible spending at a time when the kingdom faced other challenges. Adding to the friction was Henry's tendency to surround himself with foreign favorites. He was devoted to his French wife, Eleanor of Provence, and showered her Savoyard relatives with lands and powerful positions. Later, he did the same for his own Poitevin half-brothers from his mother's second marriage to the English barons. It seemed that these grasping foreigners were being given all the best titles and were draining the royal treasury, while their own traditional role as the king's chief advisors was being ignored. Henry also dreamed of winning back the great Angevin Empire that his father had lost. He poured vast sums of money into a series of poorly planned and ultimately unsuccessful military campaigns in France. These expensive failures further angered his barons, who were forced to provide the taxes and the knights for wars that brought them neither glory nor profit. They began to see their king as politically naive, a weak and ineffectual ruler who was squandering the kingdom's wealth. The goodwill that had been so carefully rebuilt during Henry's childhood began to evaporate. The barons felt their king was ignoring their counsel, favoring foreigners, and mismanaging the finances of the realm. Unlike the conflict with his father John, this was not a struggle against a vicious tyrant, but against a well-meaning but incompetent king. The spirit of Magna Carta, the idea that the king should govern in accordance with the law and with the consent of his realm, was once again stirring. The stage was being set for another great political confrontation, one that would be led by a man who was, ironically, both a foreigner and the king's own brother-in-law, the charismatic and ambitious Simon de Montfort. The growing crisis of Henry III's reign came to a head in 1258. The king's latest disastrous scheme, an attempt to place his younger son on the throne of Sicily with the Pope's backing, had left him bankrupt and politically exposed. A group of 7 powerful barons, led by the king's own brother-in-law, Simon de Montfort, saw their chance. They marched into the king's great hall at Westminster in full armor, a clear and unmistakable threat. They did not demand a new charter, but something far more radical, a complete reform of the entire system of government. What they forced upon the king became known as the Provisions of Oxford. This was a revolutionary document that, for a time, effectively ended absolute monarchy in England. It stipulated that the king could now only rule with the advice and consent of a council of 15 barons. This council would have the power to appoint the great officers of state and to control royal policy. Furthermore, it was agreed that a parliament, including 12 representatives chosen by the barons, must meet 3 times a year to oversee the running of the kingdom. The king had been placed under the control of his own subjects. For a few years, this fragile experiment in constitutional government held, but Henry III, like his father John before him, deeply resented these restrictions on his God-given authority. He skillfully played for time, and, in 1261, he obtained a bull from the Pope, absolving him from his oath to uphold the provisions. He dismissed the baronial council, and the country once again slid inevitably towards civil war, a conflict known as the Second Barons' War. At the head of the baronial cause was the formidable Simon de Montfort. He was a man of intense piety and military skill, a charismatic leader who championed the cause of reform not just for the benefit of the barons, but, he argued, for the good of the entire realm. His cause was popular not just with his fellow nobles, but with the lesser knights, the citizens of towns like London, and the scholars of Oxford, who saw him as a champion against royal mismanagement. The conflict reached its climax at the Battle of Lewes in 1264. De Montfort, a brilliant general, outmaneuvered the larger royal army and won a stunning victory. Both King Henry III and his formidable son and heir, Prince Edward, were taken captive. In a single day, Simon de Montfort had made himself the uncrowned King of England. Now in control of the government, de Montfort took an unprecedented step to broaden his base of support. In 1265, he summoned a parliament, but it was unlike any that had met before. In addition to the traditional great barons and clergy, de Montfort commanded that each shire in England send 2 knights as representatives, and, for the very first time, that each major town or borough send 2 citizens or burgesses. This was the first time that commoners, who were not landowning knights, had been invited to participate in the general assembly of the realm. It was a revolutionary moment, the distant origin of what would one day become the House of Commons. De Montfort's rule, however, was brief and troubled. His domineering style alienated some of his key allies, and his hold on power was always precarious. The great turning point came when the brilliant and ruthless Prince Edward escaped from his captivity. Edward was a far more capable leader than his father, and he quickly rallied the disgruntled royalist lords to his banner. The final act of the drama came at the Battle of Evesham in 1265. Edward used the tactics he had learned from de Montfort to trap the rebel army in a bend of the river Avon. The battle was a brutal, one-sided slaughter. De Montfort, seeing the hopelessness of his situation, fought to the death. After he fell, his body was brutally mutilated by the vengeful royalists. The rebellion was over, and King Henry III was restored to his throne. Simon de Montfort was dead, but the revolutionary idea he had championed, that representatives of the towns and shires should have a voice in the running of the kingdom, would not die with him. The man who inherited the throne from the gentle Henry III was a king of a very different mold. Edward I was forged in the crucible of civil war, a formidable warrior who had learned the harsh lessons of politics by fighting and defeating Simon de Montfort. He was tall, intimidating, and possessed an iron will, earning the nickname Longshanks for his height. Edward was a driven and ambitious ruler, a great lawgiver, and a ruthless imperialist, with a powerful vision of a single, unified Great Britain, with himself as its undisputed master. Returning from crusade to take the throne in 1274, his first priority was to restore the power and prestige of the crown. He began a series of sweeping legal inquiries known as the Quo Warranto proceedings. Royal officials were sent throughout the land to ask every great baron a simple question: by what warrant do you hold your lands and privileges? This forced the nobility to legally justify their rights, reasserting the principle that all authority ultimately flowed from the king. Edward was also one of England's greatest lawgivers, earning the title the English Justinian. In partnership with his parliaments, he issued a series of great statutes that organized and codified vast areas of English law, from property rights to public order. He saw the value of the parliament that his father's enemies had championed. He summoned them regularly, not just to ask for taxes, but to legislate and to hear petitions from all levels of society. For Edward, Parliament was not a check on his power, but a tool to strengthen it, a point of contact between the king and the whole realm. His ambition soon turned to conquest. He was determined to bring the independent Principality of Wales, ruled by Prince Llywelyn ap Griffith, under his direct control. After Llywelyn defied him, Edward invaded Wales in 1277, quickly forcing the prince to submit. When the Welsh rose again in a new rebellion a few years later, Edward's response was decisive and final. Llywelyn was killed in a skirmish, and his brother David was captured and brutally executed as a traitor. Welsh independence was extinguished forever. To secure his conquest, Edward embarked on one of the most ambitious and expensive military building programs in European history. He encircled the mountains of Snowdonia with a great iron ring of castles. These were not the simple keeps of the past, but the pinnacle of medieval military design. Massive, state-of-the-art concentric fortresses like Carnarvon, Conway, and Harlech. They were built not just to defend, but to dominate the landscape and the Welsh people, a permanent and overwhelming symbol of English power. In a final symbolic act, Edward I presented his own infant son, also named Edward, to the Welsh people at Carnarvon Castle, proclaiming him as the first English Prince of Wales, a title that the heir to the English throne has held ever since. Having subdued Wales, Edward turned his gaze north, to the last independent kingdom on the island, Scotland. A succession crisis there gave him the opportunity to intervene, and he would soon earn the grim nickname by which history would remember him, Scotorum Malleus, the Hammer of the Scots. Edward I's attention now turned to the Kingdom of Scotland. A succession crisis there, known as the Great Cause, gave him the perfect opportunity to intervene. Acting as arbiter, he chose a new Scottish king, John Balliol, but forced him to swear fealty, effectively making Scotland a vassal state. When the Scots and their new king resisted this humiliation, Edward invaded in 1296 with overwhelming force. He sacked the town of Berwick with merciless brutality, stole the sacred stone of Scone, upon which Scottish kings were crowned, and declared himself the direct ruler of Scotland. His title, Hammer of the Scots, was well, but the Scottish people would not be so easily broken. Resistance erupted, not from the high nobility, but from the common people, led by a man of the lesser gentry named William Wallace. Wallace was a brilliant guerrilla leader who waged a fierce war of resistance against the English occupiers. In 1297, his small army achieved a stunning victory against a much larger English force at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. For a brief time, Wallace was the guardian of an independent Scotland. Edward, infuriated, returned from his wars in France and led a massive army north, crushing Wallace's forces at the Battle of Falkirk. Wallace was eventually betrayed, captured, and taken to London, where he was subjected to the most gruesome public execution imaginable for a traitor. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered. Edward intended to make an example of him, but in death, William Wallace became a martyr and a symbol of Scottish defiance that would inspire his people for centuries. The mantle of Scottish resistance was then taken up by a nobleman with a claim to the throne. Robert the Bruce. He had himself crowned King of Scots and renewed the war for independence. In 1307, as Edward I was marching north with yet another army, determined to crush the Bruce once and for all, the old, formidable king died. His last wish was that his bones be carried at the head of the English army until Scotland was finally conquered. His son and heir, Edward II, had no intention of fulfilling this grim request. The new king was the polar opposite of his father. He was not a warrior and had little interest in the grim business of war. His reign was dominated by his controversial and all-consuming relationships with his favorites. First, the Gascon knight Piers Gaveston, and later the Despencer family. This infuriated the powerful English barons, who saw these favorites as usurping their rightful place as the king's advisors. This internal conflict and incompetent leadership had disastrous military consequences. In 1314, Edward II was finally goaded into leading a huge English army into Scotland to deal with Robert the Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn. The smaller, brilliantly led Scottish army inflicted the most humiliating defeat in English military history. The English army was shattered, and Scottish independence was secured for the next 300 years. Edward II's reign descended into a miserable cycle of civil strife as the king feuded with his own barons, led by his cousin Thomas of Lancaster. The final, fatal blow came from his own wife, Queen Isabella. Humiliated by her husband and his favorites, she went to her native France, where she took a lover, the exiled Baron Roger Mortimer. Together, they raised an army and invaded England in 1326. The king's support completely collapsed. He was captured, and in an unprecedented move, a parliament was called that forced him to abdicate the throne in favor of his young son. The following year, the deposed Edward II was murdered in Berkeley Castle, bringing a dark and violent end to one of the most disastrous reigns in English history. The disastrous reign of Edward II gave way to one of the most glorious in English history. His son, Edward III, was the epitome of the medieval king, chivalrous, charismatic, and a brilliant military commander. He restored the prestige of the English crown and, in 1337, laid claim to the throne of France itself, beginning the epic conflict that would become known as the 100 Years' War. This new war saw English armies achieve legendary victories against overwhelming odds, most famously at and Poitiers. The humble English longbow proved to be a weapon that could fell the most powerful French knight, and for a time, English military power was supreme in Europe. This age of chivalric glory, however, was shattered by a catastrophe that no army could fight. In 1348, the Black Death swept across the land, a horrific plague that killed perhaps half of England's population. This unimaginable loss of life turned the social order upside down. With labor now scarce, the surviving peasants found they could demand higher wages and greater freedoms. The old bonds of feudalism began to fray, leading to decades of social unrest that would culminate in the Great Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Yet, amidst the turmoil of war and plague, English culture came into its own. The English language, now a rich fusion of its Anglo-Saxon and French roots, produced its first great literary genius, Geoffrey Chaucer. His masterpiece, The Canterbury Tales, with its vivid portraits of pilgrims from every walk of life, demonstrated that English was now a language capable of the highest levels of poetic expression. The late 14th century saw the troubled reign of Richard II, a king with an exalted sense of his own divine authority, whose tyrannical tendencies led to his overthrow and murder in 1399 by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke. This act of usurpation, which placed the House of Lancaster on the throne as Henry IV, created a fatal flaw in the royal succession, a dynastic wound that would fester for over half a century before erupting into open conflict. The Lancastrian dynasty reached its zenith with the heroic figure of Henry V, a brilliant general and a pious king. He renewed the war with France and, against all odds, won the legendary Battle of Agincourt in 1415. He went on to conquer much of northern France, and through the Treaty of Troyes was recognized as the heir to the French throne. It seemed the centuries-old English dream was about to be realized, but his sudden death from disease in 1422 left his infant son, Henry VI, to inherit a kingdom that would soon unravel. The long and disastrous reign of the gentle but ineffectual Henry VI saw the English lose all their hard-won territories in France, and the kingdom descend into madness and civil war. The dynastic wound opened in 1399 finally broke open, plunging the English nobility into the brutal 30-year conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. The rival houses of Lancaster, with its red rose, and York, with its white, tore the kingdom apart in a bitter struggle for the crown. This final, violent chapter of the medieval era saw kings made and unmade on the battlefield. It ended in 1485, on a muddy field at Bosworth. There, the last Yorkist king, the controversial Richard III, was defeated and killed by an invading claimant, Henry Tudor. As Henry Tudor picked up the crown from the battlefield and placed it on his own head, becoming King Henry VII, the medieval period in England came to an end. A new, more modern age, the age of the Tudors, was about to begin. As you drift now into sleep, let this 1,000-year story settle. From the ashes of Roman Britain, a kingdom was born. It was forged in the fire of Viking and Norman invasions, shaped by the law of great kings and the faith of saints. It built magnificent cathedrals and developed a parliament that would one day inspire the world. Its legacy is the very ground beneath our feet, the language we speak, and the ancient liberties we hold dear. The struggles of these distant ancestors, their triumphs and their tragedies, wove the first threads of the world we know today. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the mists of time. If you have enjoyed our story, please consider subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes, and may your sleep be deep and peaceful.